December 23rd, 1972, Three Rivers Stadium. And before you even see anything, you hear it. A roar. A kind of rolling thunder that only exists in a place like Pittsburgh. And then something else. Silence. It's a silence that isn't quiet. It's tense. It's waiting. Dan Rooney is sitting high in the stands. Too high to see clearly, but not too high to feel it. The Steelers are losing. Again. It's fourth down. There are just seconds remaining in the game. The kind of moment this franchise has lived through for 40 years. For its entire existence. Terry Bradshaw drops back. He rolls right. He throws. There's a collision. It's violent. And then Franco Harris ends up with the ball. And he's running. He's running down the sideline. Into the end zone. And here's the thing. Nobody knew if it counted. Not the players, not the coaches, not the officials, not the fans. Nobody. The Pittsburgh Steelers spent 40 years in the wilderness building toward a moment that nobody could explain. This is how they got there. And this is what it meant.
And this is Dynastic, the show that examines how champions were built. I'm J.A. Adande. You just heard from my co-host Chuck Todd, and it's evident that this episode is about the Pittsburgh Steelers. Take a look at the trophy case for the Steelers. They qualify to be on this show in every way that you could imagine. 6 Super Bowl championships, which is tied with the New England Patriots for the most in NFL history. The only team to win Super Bowls in back-to-back years twice in 1974-75 and 1978-79 seasons. They have 8 Super Bowl appearances, tied for second with 3 other teams for the most Super Bowls. The Patriots have the most with 11. The 6-2 record in Super Bowls, Steelers have the best winning percentage, 750, of the 5 teams with at least 8 appearances. Chuck, what do you have?
Well, look, I mean, it is remarkable, this run. It was almost like, we start obviously with that, with giving you a taste of the greatest play in NFL history, I think, as it was voted, the Immaculate Reception, because in some ways the Dynasty, the Steelers were reborn that day. They were born in July of 1933, but they were reborn that day. And from that moment, I love this. The Steelers won 24 division titles. AFC North or Central. They won 7 consecutive AFC Central titles from 72 to 79 alone. So in that period of their 4 Super Bowls, they won basically, you just sort of, they were counted in. When you take Mike Tomlin's consecutive non-losing seasons, couple them with what Noll did in 69, the franchise with only 3 head coaches in that period. Tomlin never had a losing season in nearly 20 years. It's an NFL record for any coach, so it's hard not to put that in a trophy case as well.
And they did it all, obviously, Chuck Noll will be the first to tell you, because they had great players. Yes, they've had stability with their coaches, but they've had some tremendous talent walk through there. As a whole, the organization has 32 members, players and staff in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That's tied for the third most. Cowboys, Giants, and Washington. The Steelers are the only franchise with 3 ownership and front office members in the Hall of Fame. Art Rooney Sr., Dan Rooney, and Bill Nunn. In the 1994 NFL 75th anniversary team, 5 players from those 1970 Steelers were on that 75th anniversary team. That was the most of all the Dynasty teams to that point. And that talent that came through, look, I'm not a big fan of the NFL draft. I think it's completely overhyped.
Wow.
I feel like,
that's a hot take there, J.A.
It's overhyped. I've been known to say this. I check out every year on Around the Horn. I would just check out around draft time myself. I'll talk to you again late April. I want nothing to do with the NFL draft.
Boy, so you're not watching the Combine?
One of the the Combine is even worse. If I wanted to watch people running and jumping and lifting weights, I would watch the Summer Olympics. Right? The Combine is not football. I want to watch football.
Okay, but let
People
me ask you
walking
as a
on stage
reporter.
and putting on a cap and shaking the commissioner's hand is not football, right? These are football players, but they're not playing football. I do not watch the NFL draft.
But as a reporter, I got to think. Look. I'm the outsider here, but I've always thought as a reporter, probably the best place to source build would be the combine.
It is a great place for source building. However,
Yeah.
reporting on the draft is a great way to get lied to. That's another reason I don't like the draft
You
because
don't like being lied
there's
to.
never
Huh?
more fiction put out, even by normally reliable sources, than leading up to the draft. There's so much misinformation that is spread. Another
Well,
thing
guess
to
what?
hate about
If
the
it
draft.
wasn't for misinformation, the Steelers wouldn't have gotten one of their Hall of Fame wide receivers.
Well, withholding of information. I wouldn't say it was misinformation. It was just
We'll get to
withholding
that.
information a little bit and access to data, which existed as film back then. Uh, to me, the greatest case against the draft was when Tom Brady faced off against Kurt Warner as the Patriots and the Rams in the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
One quarterback was drafted in the 6th round. The other quarterback wasn't drafted at all. And here they were competing for the Super Bowl in a pivotal moment in NFL history. So there's your NFL draft. However, despite my feelings for the draft, we're here to talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers today. And the reason we're talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers is because they had the greatest draft run probably in the history of all American sports.
It's not even close, yeah.
And highlighted by the 1974 draft, which produced a total of 500 and Hall of Fame players. They drafted 4. They picked up another one as an undrafted free agent. So the greatest haul in NFL history. So the Steelers became the Steelers as we know them. They became dynastic because they mastered the draft from the late 60s into the 1970s.
And again, we're going to be learning this throughout this episode. What's amazing is before they became great at the draft, they were horrendous at the draft. They cared about, they had coaches that were like you, J.A. They didn't care about the draft. They kept trading away picks. Give me veterans. They didn't want the young guys. And then suddenly they realized, we talk about the 5 Hall of Fame guys in one draft with the 74 draft, but they have 9 Hall of Famers between 69 and 74 in the draft itself. It is a 6-year run. You throw in Joe Greene, Mel Blount, Terry Bradshaw, Ham, Hare. I mean, and the entire 74 class. It's really not a close call. I mean, I guess you could say those Niners, the Niners might have come close in the late 70s, early 80s with the success they had in the draft, but boy, nothing like this.
Yeah, they mastered the draft and also benefited from being ahead of the time. We did our first episode on the Dodgers, and of course, the transformational hiring of and signing of Jackie Robinson is such a pivotal part of their history. But the Steelers benefited from being ahead of the curve when it came to thinking about race and which players they would and would not take, and were more willing and able to search for Black players and to be comfortable with an integrated locker room than other teams in the league were. And so that enabled them to get ahead. So to me, and we'll come back to this, but it's not that they were super progressive, but the lack of barrier, not seeing race as a barrier, not being inhibited by race certainly benefited to them. So the fact that they had the greatest draft run in sports history, certainly NFL history, that plus their organizational stability and their somewhat progressive nature turned them from an afterthought into one of the league's premier franchises. I think we'll be revisiting those themes throughout this episode. Right now, the Steelers matter to me on a personal note because they're my introduction to the NFL, really. So the first Super Bowl I remember watching was Super Bowl 13 in 1979. That was Steelers, Cowboys in the Orange Bowl. I still remember the score. It's probably one of the only scores that I can remember at the top of my head. And it was Pittsburgh 35, Dallas 31. And my enduring image from that is the NFL film shot that I must have seen at some point, not too long afterward. But it's a shot from behind the end zone. It's a close-up of Terry Bradshaw dropping back to pass and releases the ball. And there's that signature NFL film shot of the spiraling football descending through the air. And Lynn Swann leaps up, grabs it, comes down in the end zone. And I'd say my fandom from the NFL really was born in that moment. What's your connection to the Steelers? What was your introduction to the Pittsburgh Steelers?
Well, it's interesting. My first Super Bowl memory is the last one. It's the of that 4 era. I remember everything about the Rams. Yeah, it's the Ferragamo Super Bowl, the Rams Steelers Super Bowl. And it was, it felt like it was all about, this is the end? And the question was it the beginning of something for the Rams? It turned out not to be at all. But that, for me, I remember the game. And I also remember that Rams team because I remember watching the NFC Championship game with Tampa Bay, right, where Tampa Bay snuck into that thing.
With Doug Williams.
I think it was like a 9-6
9-6.
Yes,
yeah,
it was like just it was the first time I remember watching a football game that was low scoring where everybody was interested, of people that I was around with my family. But let me throw this at you. We're obviously the word dynasty is in here, and we believe you know it when you see it, and there's no doubt that when you look at this period of time for the Steelers, that their 6-year run might be as good as any 6 to 8 year run you can come up with. You got the 5 NFL championships for the Packers that sort of, overlapped with the beginning of the Super Bowl era. You have what the Patriots did, sort of 6 in 13 years, 14 years. I don't know, maybe 4 out of 6 is as good as anybody could do. Can you ever lose dynasty status? How many more? When do you have to keep going? How do you keep? Because I'd argue the Steelers in some ways it's like they elevated themselves, and they created a new floor, right? Like the Steelers not in the playoffs, you think what's wrong with the Steelers, right? It's almost automatic, but they're no longer automatic at getting to the Super Bowl.
No, certainly the dynasty is long gone, just like the Celtics dynasty or the UCLA basketball dynasty of the 1960s. I mean, that is an era, but again, they can remain dynastic. And sort of my ground rules for this show is I think a team needs at least 3 championships to be considered eligible for what we're talking about, but it doesn't mean they have to come within a confined stretch, right? But the Steelers have both they had their dynasty mode, and then they've been kind of continuously defined by success since then, right? The fact that the Tomlin lack of losing record throughout the entirety of his coaching tenure with the Pittsburgh Steelers speaks to that standard, that baseline, right? So there's a level of greatness that they just don't lose. I mean, there were a couple losing seasons for Noll near the end. Cowher certainly had a couple there, but bottom line, the expectations and the standards for this franchise, this is a winning franchise, right? So they might not always be champions, but it's impossible not to think of the Pittsburgh Steelers and not think of them as winners. And again, I was first introduced to them as Super Bowl champions. So they're almost a separate category, right? They have their dynasty, but they've also had sustained excellence. And that's something that we'll look at. But it's not the entire history of the Steelers,
the history,
right? It's not like they were born into greatness and were destined for greatness.
No.
So you want to take us back to the beginning days of this franchise?
I do. One other thing I want to point out, you tell me this before we go to the beginning days, which is Steelers, Cowboys, Packers, who else that no matter where you hold the game, there'll be a slew of their fans that show up, right? If the Steelers are playing in Germany, if they're playing in Miami, if they're playing in Seattle, Steelers fans show up, right? They just... And for a small town, right? And I feel this way about the Packers. The fact that the Packers and the Steelers, in some ways, have the 2 most devoted national fan bases. That says something about the NFL too, doesn't it?
Yeah, truly national team, and we'll get into the reasons and the strategic NFL decision that I think helped enable that, right? These national followings for these small market teams. But you're right. They are the 3 NFL teams. To me, the Steelers are on the level with the Celtics and the Lakers and the Yankees when it comes to just broad fan bases that are going to be heard from no matter where the team is playing.
Did you have that friend that was like the fan of all the championship teams? You know what I mean? Like whoever was winning in whatever sport, they suddenly were
funny.
that fan.
One of my best friends is actually the opposite. So he was actually from Pittsburgh. So he liked the Steelers, but he was more a fan of the Seattle Seahawks. He was a fan of the Chicago White Sox. He rooted for the San Antonio Spurs in the 80s and then the Indiana Pacers. So he was one that always kind of went against the grain. I was more likely to, be a fan of the Steelers, and in addition to the Lakers and the Dodgers. So
Mm-hmm.
I was more of a front runner than that. But yeah, there's those people that you'll see, they're Yankees / Cowboys / Lakers.
Well,
fans,
let's be
right?
honest. There were plenty of front runner Steelers fans in the 70s too. They came out in the 80s. But when we dug into this, I think the surprise for me is how you've basically had one ownership. One family has owned this team since the very beginning. Art Rooney, Sr., 1933. It's the Great Depression. Pittsburgh, obviously, is big industrial town, big steel town. It's a hard labor town. Now, football's very popular in this region at the time, but it wasn't a main attraction. The Pirates were around and more popular. College football, the Pitt Panthers and the Duquesne Dukes were in some ways more popular football teams in Pittsburgh than any professional football was. But Pennsylvania had blue laws, and in 1933 they finally get rid of the blue laws. And so a couple of years after the founding of the NFL, Art Rooney pays $2,500 for the franchise rights for what is then the Pittsburgh Pirates. Quite a few early NFL teams shared the name with the baseball teams, the assumption being just they figured, I guess we weren't worried about branding back then, or you wanted to
associate with the known entity, right?
With the baseball teams. I mean, I think there was a Brooklyn Dodger football team at one point on that front. But what's interesting about Art Rooney, and the thing that sort of blew me away, right, because the Rooney name and the NFL, Rooney Rule, you put everything in there. It's like, well, the Rooneys, they're one of the first families of football. You might argue they are the first family of football. Well, guess who wasn't a big football fan? Art Rooney. He was a boxer, and in fact, if you believe his son, he could have been an Olympic boxer and won a gold medal in 1920 Olympics. He loved to play baseball. But he was basically the local sports promoter. If you had a boxing match, or you wanted to try to bring a barnstorming baseball team to the area, or you wanted to do some sort of event, you called up Art Rooney, and he found a way to find people and get it done. And he loved the horse track. And I know this was a favorite story of yours.
Absolutely. And it's not true that he bought the team with winnings from the horse track, but he did.
He didn't need that much winnings. He only needed $2,500.
So he actually made a lot more money than that. Like if prices had been going for what they were going maybe a few decades later, he could have afforded that with his winnings from the track. So I like this story that he won about $20,000 on a Saturday night at the Empire City Racetrack in Yonkers, New York, helped by a bet on Seabiscuit. Seabiscuit paid off for him. So I love the fact that we're tying into the Seabiscuit story. So he took his
We'll
winnings.
Get to that dynasty down the road, right?
Yeah, Seabiscuit is definitely dynastic. So he took his winnings. He bought a car. He didn't buy a franchise. He did buy a car with his winnings, drove to the Saratoga racetrack. And there, in that session, he wins $108,000. By the time he was done on this trip, he'd won anywhere from $200,000 to $380,000 total. This was all in the book, Their Life's Work by Gary Pomerantz. That was a primary source material for me. So as adept as he proved to be at running an NFL franchise, early on, he showed a proclivity for being much more skillful at the racetrack.
In Dan Rooney's autobiography, he talks about, his father was just knew how to read a racing form. And, if anybody, if you ever spend time with old guys at tracks, that they just know how to do this. There is a reading between the lines. There is figuring this out. And he was one of those guys. And he just knew, and they did say, that money, it didn't go to pay the franchise, but it did help make payroll a couple and keep the franchise afloat. So he did use the money for that. But let's make no mistake that the Pittsburgh franchise, they were sort of losers right away. They're known as the Pittsburgh Pirates, and this is a name that they keep for a while. They lose a lot of games. They lose money. They had to play in other cities to survive because they didn't always get great attendance. They played in Youngstown, Louisville, New Orleans. They were just staying afloat. And look, you can make an argument, J.A., that Art Rooney was just sort of not the best owner, right? He wasn't a football guy. He didn't necessarily have football people running it. He was always looking for somebody else. What was interesting is his oldest son became obsessed with football. And so Dan, over time, becomes the football savant and cares more about football than Dad, who still cares more about baseball. There's this great anecdote that, when they were in the car, first thing he is always looking for is the baseball game. Art Sr., not the football game. But they just have all sorts of bad luck. Even when they stumble onto some good players, they disappear. Bill Dudley is the first great player they have. Fine, he leaves. They have a good coach, Jock Sutherland. He dies. The one year they make the playoffs, there's a players' strike. It really is sort of it's one step forward, two steps back, almost all the way, really, up until the 60s.
And they don't have much of an identity, right? They kind of come and go. There's nothing to preserve, right? And so at one point they merged with the Philadelphia Eagles.
During the war, right? During
Yeah.
World War II, all the NFL teams are struggling to field teams, right? Because the guys are getting called to play the war.
So they're the Steagles.
Imagine telling Eagles fans today that, right? They would just drive them both crazy. Well, I mean, literally oil and water is Steelers and Eagles. But we had the Steagles.
The Steagles. We had the Card Pits. They merged with the Chicago Cardinals during the war as well.
Called the Carpets because they were just walked all over, right?
So even though they combine, they just, it's like they the worst of both franchises kind of came to the forefront. That team went 0-10. And we speak of names and trying to keep track of things. So if you're like me, you have trouble keeping track of all the Rooneys and figuring out which Rooney is which. I mean,
right. Well, by the way, the Rooneys have that trouble, apparently.
I mean, it's great that it's been family owned, but when all the key figures in the organization have the same last name, it can be hard to keep track. But I came to understand through reading their lives' work, it makes more sense in that, because it's an Irish family, they follow the Irish customs, which you name your firstborn son after your father or the son's grandfather, right? So Art Rooney Sr., his father was Dan. So his firstborn son's name was Dan, named after his own dad.
Right.
The next son was named Art Jr. Once you name one after your dad, then you can name one after yourself.
And Dan did the same thing, right?
Yeah. So Dan's first son was named after
Art.
His father. So he's
Right.
Art the second, right?
Right.
Because Art Jr. is already taken. So Dan's son is Art the second. That child's grandfather was the original Art, aka the Chiefs. I'm not sure who has dibs on Art the third for the next generation, but
man, well, look, I'm not going to stereotype, but Irish Catholic family is all I'm saying. There's a reason the Rooneys became Dan. Some people may not realize he was Barack Obama's ambassador to Ireland. And in
even
fact,
though they were Republican historically,
I briefly, I remember when he came to the White House, and I got one of those brief interviews with the elder Rooney. It was one of the fun moments of
this is Dan. Dan's the elder Rooney at that point, right?
At that point, it's Dan, the other elder Rooney. But what epitomizes the sort of Dynasty Steelers, and where, so the low point is obviously these war years where they're having to merge in order to keep the franchise afloat. But there's a weird ownership swap for a day, that had to do with they were going to sell one, and then Rooney came back. Rooney ended up still with the Steelers, but it was kind of confusing when they were bringing in a new franchise in Boston. There was a fight with the Washington franchise who thought they still had the rights to Boston because the Washington franchise actually originated in Boston. But I want to get to the 50s because it's identifying the problems with this franchise in the 50s that puts them on a path to become essentially the greatest drafting franchise of all time, beginning in the late 60s, early 70s. In the 50s, they're the team that uses the draft the least. In fact, I remember Dan Rooney, who got to help run these draft rooms then. He's still young. He's still considered the kid, right? The head coach essentially kept trading away the draft picks because he wanted veterans. He didn't believe in playing rookies. He didn't believe in trying to develop young players. He would trade them away. And at one point, there was one year, imagine a NFL franchise is not getting an NFL draft pick until the 8th round, J.A. And 1 year in the 50s, they had to wait till the 8th round to make their first pick in the draft. And there's probably no moment that epitomizes the sort of the poor draft structure, the poor player development structure than the Johnny Unitas story.
Yeah, so they could have had they had Unitas and they just let him go. They didn't want him around, right?
Well, what made it more frustrating is he was a local kid.
Yeah.
So everybody knew the kid, you know.
He was the all-star. He was on the starting quarterback on the all-star team among the Pittsburgh Catholic high schools. The second team all-star starter was young Danny Rooney. But their coach, Buddy Parker, was the coach. He did not like rookies. He didn't want this young Unitas guy around anywhere. So decades before Les Snead, the general manager of the LA Rams, after they'd moved back to Los Angeles, and he trades away all their picks so that they can win the Super Bowl. They do win the Super Bowl. And at the Super Bowl victory celebration, he's wearing a T-shirt that says, F them picks. So I could imagine, you know, if it would have been in vogue back then, Buddy Parker would have had a T-shirt that said F them picks, because that was basically his philosophy. He did not want rookies around. He did not have patience for them. No. And so, yeah, as a result, they missed out on Johnny U.
They had him. He gets cut in the preseason. I don't think he even gets to play in one game at all. Look, I'm always careful. In Dan Rooney's account, he was pushing, no, you got to give him a chance. You got to give him a chance. Anyway, it's sad. He ends up leaving camp. He thinks his career is over. He gets a job in construction. He plays semi-pro football. And then, of course, the Baltimore Colts find him, and, the rest is history. But, that, when you look at various forks in the road, I would argue this is probably the single most important fork for this franchise before, right? If the 70s doesn't happen, you might argue this Johnny U missed opportunity is sort of like the Red Sox trading Babe Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of doomed to failure. Then they could have had a get-out-of-jail-free card on a Monopoly board because they drafted Len Dawson, first overall pick in 1957, and they let him go. And he goes on to win a Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs.
Well, as they weren't just losing games, they were losing the future, right? They just immediately lost the future. And so it is interesting when you're trying to sort of tell the story of the most stable professional franchise, maybe in all of professional sports. It took them, let's see, it's born in 1933. The first draft they get right is 1969. It essentially takes them 37 years to figure out how to build a football team.
Well, anyone can have an off decade or so, right? That's what they used to say in Chicago with the Cubs when they went a century. Anyone can have an off century, between winning a World Series or so. So they had a downstretch. But, yeah, once they got it right, boy, did they get it right.
All right, so it's now the 60s, and we're starting to see the importance of television, speaking of Johnny Unitas.
Thanks to Johnny Unitas in the greatest game ever played. The
greatest game ever played.
NFL championship, the Colts and the New York Giants at Yankee Stadium, and that ushers in the television era for the NFL. And it could have been the Steelers, but instead it was the Baltimore Colts and Johnny U.
And it becomes, and suddenly the league realizes, okay, there's money to be made here. And what's nuts is how all the teams were cutting their own deals. So some teams would be CBS on CBS. I think the Packers were with CBS and the Steelers were with CBS and some kind of deal with others, and you had the AFL in there, you had the NFL,
the
individual
Dumont
teams
network.
doing
You had other networks that didn't survive, but they were
like
certainly a
regional
part of the
networks, yeah.
NFL. Yeah,
And but the point was, it was every franchise for themselves, right? The leagues themselves were not controlling this, and you know they need sort of some organization. Well, enter a guy named Bert Bell, and he's basically the most, before there's Pete Rozelle, who's considered sort of, obviously in some ways some people may think he's the founding commissioner. He wasn't, but he's certainly the commissioner that sort of created the modern NFL. But Bert Bell did a lot of work to help create and plant the seeds of the modern NFL. What's interesting about Bert Bell is he at one time was a co-owner of the Steelers with Art Rooney. He was one of his business partners. So he's a big part of the early history of the NFL, and he's now the commissioner. And Bell looks at television, and he's worried that it's a threat, right? There's this fear that TV, that instead of sitting in a stadium in the open air in 30-degree weather, that people are going to say, hey, I like this football, but I'd much prefer watching football in my house, where I've got the temperature under control. So he comes up with a radical idea. He wants to create, he says, no home games can be on TV within 75 miles of where the game is being played. That's why the idea was, if you want to watch your team, you go to the stadium. In some ways, this is the birth of the blackout rule, right? Baseball adopts it, football. But
then the Chicago Blackhawks notoriously didn't show any
right.
home games for decades.
And this was all about the owners, because most of their revenue was more generated by ticket revenue, right? And, that was a larger chunk of where their money was coming from at the time. The TV dollars just weren't there.
Yeah, you know which game was blacked out? The Immaculate Reception game wasn't available on TV in the Pittsburgh market.
So here we are. It's 1961. Every team has its own TV deal, and the gap is pretty big, right? The Giants are making $175,000 off of their TV rights. The Packers, $75,000. So, and I know you'll be shocked to hear this, J.A., the big markets didn't want to share with the small markets.
That never happens in professional sports.
Right. There's this mythology that somehow the Maras of the Giants, no, they saw the big picture and they wanted to share. No, they weren't going to try to have an advantage. That was not true. The Maras fought this tooth and nail. They did not want to share, but they all realized that they couldn't behave this way. And so in came a young new commissioner named Pete Rozelle, and he decides if the NFL is going to survive, they have to act like one league, not 12 separate businesses. And it becomes a huge fight. And it is basically big markets versus the small and medium markets.
The greater good wins out, right? The socialists at a time when, anti-communist sentiment was a lot higher than it is today, somehow the NFL became this great capitalistic monster, thanks in part to this very socialist principle that we're going to share the wealth equally. We're going to have the national TV deals. No longer are each club negotiating its own regional television deal. We're going to have a national TV deal, and that revenue will be split equally. And that's Pete Rozelle's gift, and his enduring legacy is the national TV deal with the equal revenue. That's what enables the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Green Bay Packers of the league to remain competitive with the New York Giants and the Dallas Cowboys.
And Rooney sided with the Packers, right? That was important. And, Pittsburgh could have been a swing vote in this, others. And, this is a case where, the Rooneys are given a lot of credit to this, but it is where you start to see, this is also the beginning of the influence of the Rooneys on the league itself. That when the Rooneys speak, the league listens, right? And eventually, of course, the famous Rooney Rule comes into play. But this has been where
it's kind of interesting that it happens then, though, Chuck, because they haven't won anything, right?
No, right. but it was part of it was just generational. Dan Rooney and Pete Rozelle were both young, and so they understood each other. Rozelle, I think, was like working for the Rams at the time. Like he was just a
marketing guy. PR guy.
And so, not surprisingly, this is a case of just generations understanding each other's better. The old guys hung out with each other, and the sons and the young guys hung out with each other. And that bond of Rozelle and Rooney, because, boy, I think there's this great scene in Dan Rooney's book when Rozelle's first becomes commissioner, and George Preston Marshall, the owner of the Washington franchise, decides to come lecture the new commissioner, but he shows up at the meeting in his pajamas. like the weirdest power move you could have. And everybody is just supposed to be like, well, that's George Marshall for you. And you're like, okay. But managing that moment and not kowtowing to Marshall was an important early step for Rozelle.
Well, it's a good thing that Rozelle didn't go to Congress wearing his pajamas, right? That might not have gone over so well, but he is able to win over the politicians, right? And in 1961, President Kennedy signs the 1961 Sports Broadcasting Act, and that's what enables it. Basically grants the NFL an antitrust exemption, right? Because the league, there are all the individual entities that make up the NFL are going to act as one and negotiate as one, and that could be seen as an antitrust violation, but they're granted this exemption, and that's what enables everything. And as we record this in 2026, that 1961 Sports Broadcasting Act is very much in the news, right? Because it's been called in question by the current administration, from the FCC, and even the Department of Justice. And it's been so vital to keeping the league equitable. It's what enabled the NFL to become the most enduring and the preeminent form of mass entertainment in American history, right? It comes to prominence. It starts in 1961, and by the end of the decade, the NFL surpasses baseball as the sport that America cares the most about. And in the current age, typically well over 90 of the top 100 most watched programs on linear television every year are NFL games, right? And so it's just endured its hold on America, and in part because it gave away the product, right? The product was widely available everywhere, and so and that enabled the Pittsburghs and the Green Bays to compete, unlike in baseball, where the primary means of making money is the local television deals, and it leads to this wide discrepancies between the New Yorks of the world and the Pittsburghs. Pittsburgh's a great example of that, right? The Steelers have maintained and
they're a major market.
Yeah,
right?
I mean they're thought of like everyone else, and literally like right next door to them, the Pittsburgh Pirates have been an afterthought for basically the last 4 decades, ever since Barry Bonds left as a free agent because they couldn't afford to keep him in 1993, right? But the reason why they were allowed to exert this monopoly or have this exception to this antitrust rule was that, again, they could make the claim that you can watch all of our games for free. But now we're at the point you can need up to 10 different streaming subscriptions to watch all the NFL games.
And this is why, I mean, look, and we don't know when folks are going to be listening to this, but this is probably going to be a battle over the next couple of years. We're here in the spring of 2026. Wouldn't surprise me that this is going to be an ongoing battle between what's over the air, what is even considered over the air anymore, right? What is considered streaming? We're like the definitions and all of this stuff are going to continue to change. But the bottom line is, without the NFL having equal, essentially sharing all their revenue, they wouldn't be the powerhouse. If baseball shared all their revenue, baseball would be probably be in a healthier position today. The NBA shares more of its revenue, and as a league, in some ways, they have more healthy teams than baseball does. And you could argue it's because of these revenue sharing aspects of it. And in many ways, what the NFL created, the NBA essentially is modeled, and Major League Baseball would love to get closer to that model.
maybe depending on when you listen to, you could be in the midst of an NFL labor or and Major League Baseball labor shutdown, right? Because that's the looming battle: is will there be a salary cap? Uh, what will as so their revenue, their national television revenue is declining, right? So they don't have this option that the NFL has had, where they can get billions of dollars every year. So the NFL, their counter argument to these allegations now that the consumer, the customer is being deprived, is that, hey, 87% of the games are still available on television, and all the games are available on free TV in the team's local markets. But in an era of cord cutting where people might not have over-the-air television, they might not have network television available to them, now you're asking them to subscribe to a multitude of streaming service, and as it's become national. So the argument is, hey, you can watch your local team, but part of the success of the NFL is that you might be living in Phoenix, Arizona, and you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers. They are a national team, and it's going to be harder and harder to watch all the Steelers
But
games.
let me just tell you what blackout rules do. Okay, as a kid, so Miami is notoriously known as sort of not always the a city where sports fans will show up for the regular season, right? It's a winter's town. Okay, I'm not gonna sit here and, I will own the idea that Miami's always been a winter's town, and LA has a little bit of that. Hey, when you live in paradise, right? There's a lot of competition for.
You got to win.
But so the Miami Dolphins, when I was growing up, were on Monday Night Football always 3 times a year, always, and it always felt like twice a year. They were at home, and usually one of those 2 games didn't sell out. So you know what that meant? Monday Night Football, we couldn't watch it.
Wow.
And so, you know how many times I've seen the Rocky Blyer movie? Because they would actually, to tie it back to the Steelers, what they would do, local Channel 10, right? For those of you that grew up in Miami, they were the ABC affiliate. So they would basically run a football movie in place of the game. So the Rocky Blyer story, that, and Longest Yard, the Burt Reynolds version of The Longest Yard, pre-Adam Sandler. I feel like those movies were on a blackout rotation, But no, I promise you, the first time I saw the Rocky Blyer story was due to a blackout rule. And you know what that didn't do? It didn't help the Miami Dolphin fandom in Miami. And so these blackout rules, I think, are so counterintuitive. And you think you're being pro-fan, you're actually being anti-fan, right? You are punishing your fans who can't watch that game. I think I might be a better Dolphins fan today as a kid had that blackout rule didn't exist. I think it's terrible. So we ought to move, because there's one more piece of off-the-field business we ought to get to until we can start really living in the heart of this era, and that's the merger, the AFL-NFL merger, because I think this is where the Raiders-Steelers rivalry starts to begin. Because, so Al Davis, first he's upset that he's not the first commissioner. He's, of course, the commissioner of the AFL. Pete Rozell's commissioner of the NFL. And I know you'll be shocked to know when they decided, well, who should be the commissioner of the combined league? There weren't many votes for Al Davis, J.A. So Al Davis is already bitter and angry. Well, they have one issue that they got to deal with in the merger, and that is evening out the conferences. So the AFL is going to become the AFC, and the NFL is going to become the NFC. Well, they needed to move 3 NFL teams, had to agree to move to the AFC and essentially be with all the AFL teams. And nobody wanted to move, right? That was not something. So there was an enticement. You got a $3 million franchise bonus, I believe it was, to if you agreed to move leagues. That's a lot of money back then. So
it's a lot in the 60s.
So the Steelers were concerned about their division. They were concerned about certain rivalries. So the biggest thing that Rooney had to do was convince his friend Art Modell, owner of the Browns, to come over, right? He had a NFL expansion that brought the Browns in the early 50s. And Modell agrees. So now you got the Colts, the Steelers, and the Browns. The next thing is divisions. And this is where Rooney basically, they're hemming and hawing, and they're using, well, no, I'm not going to go unless we get the division that we want. And they get guaranteed, in order to seal the deal for Pittsburgh to agree to go over, they get guaranteed that their division is going to be Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Houston. And so the AFC Central is born. When this deal happens, Al Davis loses his shit, and he gets all angry. And this is my favorite story. Vince Lombardi physically grabs Al Davis. This was in the Rooney book, so I'm citing Rooney on this one. Grabs him by the lapels, pins him to the wall, and says, "You're not going to cause any more trouble here." I mean, I just love the fact that it's Lombardi who essentially tells. Yeah, it is, right? You have the Rudy's Lombardi. It is Lombardi at this meeting, right? They're having this big meeting about the merger, and he physically, Al Davis is throwing a hissy fit, and he's threatening all sorts of stuff, going to walk out, and Lombardi just grabs him and pins him on the wall. So maybe that's why he earned the name on the trophy just as much as all the winning. Jay, I find one of the more remarkable statistics, the fact that that the Cleveland Browns and the Detroit Lions, have never even been to a Super Bowl, that their last championships are all pre-Super Bowl on that front. And, with the
It
poor
had
Lions.
60 years to do it.
Yeah. With the Lions, I've always thought, like, I feel like they need to manufacture a jinx of some sort, right? The curse of the Bambino or a Billy Goat thing. And
yeah, make it more romantic at least, right?
Yeah, well, I think I think there's a straight line here, right? I think the Lions win an NFL title in like 57, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the last time they win. I think it's within 3 or 4 years that the famous writer George Plimpton decides to embed himself in the season, right? And it's a Paper Lion. And I remember the movie version where he's, I guess in training camp and trying to be a quarterback. Ever since they sort of played with the football gods, right, with that little stunt, they've been terrible ever since, and they haven't gotten back. They got to do something, right? I don't know if it's burning a George Plimpton effigy or some sort, but maybe you burn a Paper Lion or whatever it is.
Burn
but
a Paper Lion.
Yeah.
Make a little Lions logo, burn it up. So, yeah, the Lions in Cleveland, of course, they were great with Jim Brown, but it all happened pre-Super Bowl era. And so I would rather be like the Steelers and have all my success be post-Super Bowl. So, yeah, they were miserable, but no one knows, or no one certainly thinks about the fact that they were so bad, because very early in the Super Bowl era, and as the Super Bowl was becoming this national celebration and festival, it coincided with the rise of the Steelers. So we think of them as great because they've been great and contending pretty much throughout the duration of the Super Bowl era.
They've basically been great since we've had color television.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, right? The Packers were sort of the last franchise of the black and white TV NFL, right? And to me, the Steelers are the first time the NFL's in color. And
no one has seen what successful Cleveland Browns football franchise looks like in color. But we can give Cleveland some sort of credit and give them some connection to this Steelers dynasty, not just the logo, but again, the fact that Chuck Noll learned his ways from Paul Brown playing as an undersized offensive lineman on the Cleveland Browns. There is some sort of connection and tie there. So as we get to Chuck Noll, just keep Cleveland in mind, right? We Cleveland fans, poor, downtrodden Cleveland fans, need a little something. So we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about Chuck Noll. That's coming up after the break, and just keep Cleveland in mind when we do that.
So the history of football coaches in the Pittsburgh Steelers, J.A., if you talk to Dan Rooney, it was basically the first person Art liked, he said, great, make him coach. And they didn't really go through much of an interview process. If Art liked them, and all of a sudden you went from one interview to hire. And, well, let's just say this wasn't working. And so this time they decided they're really going to do a real search. And the irony, though, is that the first candidate they interview is Chuck Noll. And everybody falls in love with Chuck Noll, but because they had such bad luck,
they didn't trust their instinct.
Right. So they said, well, we better.
Like the Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink, right?
Right. We better go interview other people, including this young head coach for a college football team in Happy Valley named Joe Paterno.
Yeah, that's one of those sliding door moments. What would have happened? How different would the fates of both Penn State and the Steelers have been if they had hired Joe Paterno? I think Joe Paterno could have been a successful NFL coach. As successful as Chuck Noll, we'll never know. But it wound up working out great, both for the Penn State and Nittany Lions and for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And you know who they brought along to try to convince Paterno to come to the NFL? Vince Lombardi. He was done with the Packers.
Italian
so
to Italian.
Kind of around.
Yeah.
So Rooney brings Lombardi to try to talk to. So look, another intersection. Like Lombardi is just kind of everywhere at this stage. If he's not accosting Al Davis, here he is trying to persuade Joe Paterno to come to the NFL.
But this is a reminder, right? The NFL is still a fairly small organization, and even when they merged with the AFL, and these stories with Lombardi and all of these stories where the head coach is in charge of everything, right? The head coach isn't just worrying about, today we're used to, shoot in baseball, the manager only has to worry about like this. There's a lineup guy, there's a this guy, there's a that guy, and NFL, there's all sorts of specialty coaches for individual players. But back then, man, your head coach had to do all sorts of things, including politicking.
But especially come draft, he was very important.
What's interesting about the college connections, the Steelers, there was one year during their, during the loser days, if you will, in the 30s and 40s, where they hired the Duquesne football coach and let him keep coaching Duquesne and the Steelers in the same season. Let's just say when they finally decided that he needed to pick one team, he picked Duquesne, which, by the way, Duquesne football, it no longer exists. It is long gone on that front. But Chuck Noll is finally agreed upon, and in many ways, this is probably the next incredible fork in the road, right?
Yeah.
After the miss on United,
10 coaches, right?
Yeah. What's the stat? Like we know the stat from Noll forward, but they hire Noll in 1969. The franchise is born in 1933. In 36 years, is it 12 coaches? 13?
Well, no, he was their fourth coach in 6 years. The 14th coach in Steelers history.
Yeah,
what I have here. Yeah,
basically 13 coaches in 36 years.
Yeah. And
13 coaches in 36 years.
And then, 4 and 6. And then when the Steelers hired Mark McCarthy this year, he became their fourth coach in the last 57 years. So from 4 and 6 to 4 and 57. So the concern with Noll, though, was that he was young. He was only 37 years old. And so was he too young? And there was a question because the Steelers were forward thinking. So our junior asked Noll if he had any issues with black players and if he would have a quota on black players. And Noll says, I don't care what color my players are. You find the good players where they are. And this is partly to do with Noll's background, right? He played on a neighborhood team where half the players, when he was playing youth football, half the players on the roster were black, and this is like the 1940s, 50s. So, very early on, he was ready for the evolving landscape, right? And so, there's he has the right mentality. So at his introductory press conference, a reporter tells him, this is a city of losers. And Noll says, well, we'll change history. And indeed he did.
That's what makes their Mike McCarthy hire the strangest of them all. He's so old compared to what they're used to.
It surprised a lot of people because he did go against their standards.
I mean, I'll tell you this. If McCarthy doesn't win right away, they're immediately going to say, well, that's what you get for not hiring somebody in their 30s. Yeah. I love the anecdotes about Noll in the first team meeting. And he walks in, because this is what Dan Rooney writes about. He said, the thing that impressed him the most about Noll is that in the interview, it came across that Noll knew the Steeler players better than he thought the Steelers coaches knew their own players at the time. And that Noll really was a film, like it feels like that Noll was a guy who was all over the film room, and this is what he does. And he walks into that locker room, bunch of veterans, because we know this is a team that did not believe in the draft, did not do well in the draft in the 60s. And he goes, I've watched the film. I know why you've been losing. It's not effort. This isn't a good football team, and most of you aren't going to be here.
Yeah, so they play in their first Super Bowl 5 years later, and only 5 of those players from 1969 were still on the roster, right? So, I mean, he pretty much clears house. Of course, they go on that great drafting run as well. Chuck Noll hired his coach, and Mean Joe Greene joins the Steelers on back-to-back days. Can you think of many back-to-back days in the history of any franchise that are that consequential? Noll's ways, he just very traditional, I would say. He gets in there and he kind of like John Wooden in that was really big on practice, and that would be, the game should be kind of, you're on cruise control, right? After you practice diligently, he thought games were won on, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday when you're preparing. They're not won on Sunday. You should have everything down. In the Gary Pomerantz books, he talks about Noll's emphasis was on organization, structure, and fundamentals, but he wasn't above dropping a yo mama on a player in the locker room. He could kind of exist in a multitude of ways, and he's a very, not complex, but he contained multitudes. When he played for the Cleveland Browns, he also went to law classes at night, going to law school. There's an interesting illumination on who Chuck Noll was that was in a feature story on him in Sports Illustrated in 1980. When Noll died in 2014, they reran it on the Sports Illustrated website. It was written by Paul Zimmerman, Dr. Z, their great
Dr.
football
Z,
writer.
yeah.
Yeah. And so in the story, they're in the car and they're driving by a frozen pond. And Noll asks Zimmerman, he says, what do you think of when you see that, looking at the pond? Zimmerman writes, I tell him I think of our pond at home and my kids skating and the way it looks in the late afternoon with the mist starting to come in. A poet. You see it as a poet, Noll says. What fascinates me is the science of it. It's frozen on top, strong enough to support weight, yet warm enough on the bottom to maintain life. The miracle of life. And I thought, reading that someone who could have such profound thoughts while looking at a frozen pond in the middle of winter, it's not just some meathead football coach, right? Like, this is someone who's very thoughtful. He was distrustful of the media, despite that access that he gave Zimmerman, because he thought the media really didn't understand football. I think he respected Zimmerman because, Dr. Z really did know the game inside and out, kept his own stats like separate from what the team would provide. But the media at large, he didn't really trust that much. And he thought if he gave them too much, then the opposing coaches would read it and would gain some insight that they could use to their advantage on Sundays.
It's interesting. Let's take a minute here with Noll before we get in, because, think about who his peers were in that time. You had John Madden, you had Tom Landry, you had Don Shula, right? Those were sort of, and I could argue that all of them had very, Landry, Shula, and Noll were all very reserved kind of guys, right? There was definitely that. Madden, obviously, the one that wasn't reserved, and he, of course, becomes incredibly famous. But Noll is the lowest key of all of them.
Yeah.
Right? And even to this day, I feel like when people think of the iconic Super Bowl runs and the coaches, you hear immediately Bill Walsh and the Niners, and you'll go Bill Belichick and the Patriots. You don't even I don't know why this is outside of Steelers. I'm not saying Steelers fans would say Chuck Noll and the Steelers right away because they're Steelers fans, but you don't have that same sense of recall. It's not viewed as Noll's Steelers, and I wonder how much of that is just simply Noll wasn't he wasn't thrust as the leader of that team, even though he was the leader of that team.
He wasn't into self-promotion, right? He was, I think, reluctant even to have Paul Zimmerman do those stories on him. So it's that. This is going to kind of sound silly, but we are a superficial society. Mm-hmm. Like, if you think of Landry, some of
Noll
these
has
other
more Super Bowl rings than Landry, by the way. But
yeah, I mean, he stands above so many of these
more than Bill Walsh, by the way.
Yeah, but he's not seen as the innovator of Bill Walsh. and he doesn't kind of have that stoicism of Landry. But like, honestly, like he doesn't have the jawline of like a Landry, right? Or even a Bill Cowher who replaced him, right? Like these imposing figures, a silhouette, or in John Madden's case, this larger than life figure, right? So the fact that he's more reserved, even though he's a fascinating person when you read about him, and he has a range of interests and thoughts on things, but that's not what necessarily what we look for in our coach.
No,
Right?
but he does match something else. There was a time where everybody thought that the best coaches are the players that never got on the field, right? Because they're sitting on the sidelines, like Don Shula. What made him a great coach? I think one time he said it's because I wasn't good enough to get on the field, so I was able to watch. And in some ways, that's the Chuck Noll origin story. There's this great story about him as a walk-on at Notre Dame. And he gets dropped by Leahy, who's the coach at the time. Frank Leahy's the coach. It turned out that Noll was having an epileptic seizure. He didn't take his medication, and he didn't tell the coach about his condition. And in some ways, now everything we learn about Noll now, you're not surprised, right? He didn't want to be. There's no doubt that he didn't do it out of his own source of pride, probably.
Well, and those seizures lead to the end of his career, right?
Right.
The Browns are afraid of the medical risk and the liability if they put him out there on the field and he has a seizure. So, uh, fortunately for the Steelers, he becomes available at this critical juncture for them. So, his medical misfortune plays into the hands of the Steelers. And as I said, back-to-back days, Chuck Noll,
Yeah.
and they draft Mean Joe Greene.
And Joe Greene.
Let's speak on Joe Greene.
Yeah, because it's the, it's funny. You think of, when you think of the Pittsburgh Steelers of your certain age, you're going to think Jerome Bettis, Ben Roethlisberger, Terry Bradshaw, and you should think Joe Greene. And I think you probably now have to be over the age of 50 for Joe Greene to be that front and center. But, in some ways, he was more important than Bradshaw. I mean,
they were a defense.
Arguably, there's no Terry Bradshaw without
Yeah.
Joe Greene. Yeah.
Yeah. So he goes to North Texas State. They were the Mean Green, right? So he kind of picks up his nickname from
which he didn't like at first. He didn't like Mean Joe Greene.
Yeah.
You're right. It had more to do with the university he was at than anything else. But he didn't like that nickname. But sometimes
it sticks with him, and it gives him an identity. And he becomes the leader of what becomes the Steel Curtain defense. I want to skip ahead a little bit to the end in 1979 and the Coke commercial, which, doing a little research, thinking about this in the course of preparing for this episode, it's kind of more significant than we might have imagined. And it comes about as it's the same ad agency that did Like to Buy the World a Coke commercial at the start of the 70s. And at the end of the 70s, they have this one.
Mr. Greene?
Yeah.
You need any help?
Mm-mm.
Want my Coke?
No.
Really, you can have it.
Okay. Thanks.
That's the way it should be. I like to say,
See you around.
the whole world is smiling with me. Coca-Cola
Hey, kid.
as life. Have a Coke and a
Wow, thanks, Mean Joe.
A woman named Penny Hockey wanted a dialogue-based ad, comes up with the idea of a kid offering a Coke to a downcast player. And Coke wanted Terry Bradshaw. But Penny Hockey liked the contrast, liked the idea of a Mean Joe Greene. So their nickname actually helped him out because it created this character, and you've got this, little hopeful white kid, and you've got big.
No,
Mean
I
Joe
mean, I
Greene.
could, you could just see it. I'm like, you're describing it now, and I could see it. And
It's etched in your mind. And for
right,
those
and
who aren't familiar with it, it's a very simple concept.
Yeah.
So Mean Joe Greene is kind of limping off the field into the locker room. I don't know why there's not a athletic trainer with him or anything.
Yeah, no, he's by himself,
Yeah,
right?
he's just walking by
limping,
himself
you know,
through the
yeah.
tunnel. He's got his jersey off, like he's clearly done for the day, and he's injured, and he's limping, making his way back to the locker room. And this kid comes up to him and offers him his Coke if it'll cheer him up, And Joe Greene grabs it and chugs it down, and now he's in a better mood. And he smiles and he says, "Hey, kid, catch!" And he tosses him his jersey. "Thanks, Mean Joe," and have a Coke and a smile. Right? I think that was the slogan at that time. They used to show that to us. We had someone, John Sawatsky, used to work with us on storytelling techniques at ESPN, and he showed us that commercial, and he showed us a different. There was a 7-Up commercial with Sugar Ray Leonard, in which Sugar Ray is boxing and sparring in the ring, and his son is there with a bunch of his friends, and they're like, "Hey, that's the champ," and the son goes, "No, that's just my dad," and he's smiling. So here's Sugar Ray Leonard, and I would say a much more telegenic, handsome person, and just just kind of a overall bubbly personality. And yet the Coke commercial featuring Mean Joe Greene is more effective. Why? Because it has change, the element of change and contrast. And that's what the writers of this commercial understood. Couple of trivia things. They shot it over 3 days. Joe Greene had to drink 20 bottles a day.
I love that.
Outtakes where he's burping.
I love that.
I would too if I had that much carbonation.
By the way, do you remember it? This commercial was so popular. I think they did a 30-minute doc on TV about it. Remember back then they would have these like holiday specials of the best ads of 1982 and the best ads of 1983. And, I can't either it was like a segment on That's Incredible, right? Or something like one of those ridiculous shows back in the day, or it was one of those specials. But I remember it was so iconic that they literally made more programming about it.
And he did win a Clio, and it repeated over the years, and it was mocked or homage to it. I think there's a version with Troy Polamalu, the great Pittsburgh Steelers defender. Later, they kind of paid homage to this. But Angel Greene actually wins a Clio, and reading on it actually, or just kind of thinking about it, it helps pave the way. It's a kind of a transition. So you had O.J. Simpson in those Breakthrough Hurts commercials where Black athletes in team sports now are getting commercials and are seen as someone that can help endorse a product and can boost the sales of your product or the usage of your product. And so Coca-Cola deemed me, Joe Greene, someone who, this menacing Black athlete as someone who could be beneficial to them and could sell their product. So, it's just another step on the way to the world that Michael Jordan takes over and just, sends into orbit with his capitalization on the road that was paved by O.J. Simpson and Dr. J, and yes, even Mean Joe Greene, paving the way for Black athletes, particularly Black athletes in team sports, to have all these endorsement opportunities.
And it is not originally a Super Bowl ad. Yes, it aired during the 4th Super Bowl, which did give it its own life, but it debuted October 1st, 1979 on Monday Night Football.
So it's funny. When he went into the Hall of Fame in 87, he was the first of the 70 Steelers to go in, and they have the parade through Canton, and people are running up to him, and Steelers fans, and they're giving him Coke bottles through it. Real quick, he was born Charles Edward Greene, but his aunt called him Joe, hoping he would become the next Joe Louis. Didn't have a father in the house. He was actually bullied a lot in school. So this is something, and it kind of comes back to Chuck Noll. There's a few players on this team that had kind of father issues, again, the late 60s, early 70s, starting divorces becoming more prevalent, or we're in the era captured, epitomized by the song Papa Was a Rolling Stone by the Temptations, right? And Joe Greene was one of those. And with Noll, you don't hear of him described as a father figure, but there must have been something that resonated with, several of these key players who didn't have that father figure or had a poor relationship with their father, and they were able to connect with Noll somehow. He was able to elicit the best out of them.
Well, and, what's interesting about the decision to draft Joe Greene is that there were others arguing that year, as always, take a quarterback. The Notre Dame quarterback was Terry Hanratty, and he was from the area, and there was some pressure there, and Noll was just like, nope, I know who I want. I want Joe Greene.
So I would like to give credit to this scout, Jess Thompson, who scouted him in North Texas State. His description was agile, mobile, and hostile as hell.
I love that. Agile, mobile, and hostile. That is pretty good. You can always get me if you can get a little rhyme in there.
Art Jr. calls Greene that he scouted him, watched film of him, calls him the most important guy we ever drafted.
Well, and look, it's interesting with the Steelers, and the issue of race, because if you said it's both never really a huge issue, and yet it is. They're at the forefront of progress without sort of it looking like it was intentional. And Joe Greene, there's a moment in the Steelers in '74, I think it's the '74 season, where there's a real quarterback controversy. They have a black quarterback in Joe Gilliam, a white quarterback in Terry Bradshaw. You also have, I think, Terry Hanratty's there. And there's a real question mark about and it's the type of thing that turned racial in the fan base.
Yes.
And it became a race thing in the fan base. It was never race in the locker room. And in fact, it was arguably Joe Greene that we don't know this, right? We can't crawl inside Chuck Noll's head, but it was Joe Greene saying, Terry Bradshaw's the quarterback I want to see us lead this team, that likely created, when Greene spoke, it seemed like the coaches listened.
Yeah, he commanded the locker room. There's another story with Gilliam that actually John Stallworth, the wide receiver, who was playing his music, and one of the white linebackers didn't like it, and turns it off, and there's kind of like a battle over the music. Mm-hmm. And what music's going to be played and who can play it, and what style is going to be played. And so Joe Greene just cuts the cord to it, like slices the cord. So now no music's going to be played, right? He cuts the cord to Stallworth's box, and Stallworth later says, you know what? Actually, that was a good move by him, because it kind of ended that argument, right? There was going to be no more debate over music because Mean Joe Greene ended it. And who knows which music Mean Joe Greene preferred, but he decided, you know what? We're not going to have any music because this music is leading to dissension. So that was a leadership act, cutting the cord of the boombox.
This is probably a good way to bring in Bill Nunn, right? And I know when we talked about, I want to take people a little bit on the inside of our sort of planning process here, and as we've been brainstorming about which franchises to do first, second, and third, your passion about the Steelers, Bill Nunn, draft, HBCU players, that this is a story that if there's ever a story with the Steelers that does not get enough attention, people may associate the Steelers when it comes to race with the Rooney Rule, understandably so, but it's Bill Nunn and the black press, Pittsburgh Courier, that arguably transforms the Steelers into their dynasty.
Yeah. So
and it's a sports writer, J.A.
A
right?
Sports writer, the hero of the story. Well, Wendell Smith, and there's a through line, actually, through our Dodgers story. And Wendell Smith was the writer for the Pittsburgh Courier, African-American writer who basically pointed out Jackie Robinson to Branch Rickey. I'm not sure Branch Rickey discovers Jackie, if not for Wendell Smith saying, hey, you really should see this guy. And one of the most consequential things that happen in the history of American sports, right? So Wendell Smith's connection here is that he leaves the Pittsburgh Courier for the Chicago Herald-American, and that creates the opening that is filled by Bill Nunn.
And Bill Nunn's father is the owner of the paper, correct?
Yeah, but Nunn wasn't sure that he wanted to do this, but here's this opportunity to do it.
And he corners the market. He becomes basically like, look, all of us journalists have done this, right? And I, political journalism, I became sort of a data geek early, before that was cool. I know you've had your specializations. Every journalist wants to specialize, and Bill Nunn became the guy following HBCU football that nobody else was doing, right?
Yeah, and so he'd have the historically black college university All-American list. And, most NFL teams weren't paying attention. It helped that the Steelers were in Pittsburgh. And so the Rooneys said, hey, we can benefit from this. So not only did
Nunn was a little skeptical of the Rooneys, because he didn't think much of the Steelers as a franchise, and he didn't think much of the team. And I think he thought maybe they didn't think much of, and didn't take it seriously.
Well, he was having a hard time getting credentialed for the games, right? And so pest boxes still weren't the most integrated places. So he stopped coming to the games. He's like, if you're not going to make it easy, if you're going to put me through all this stuff to get a credential, as a member of the black press, if you're not going to treat me equally, I'm just not going to come to the games. And so Dan Rooney notices this. He says, why haven't I seen you? And he says, he wants to meet. And so Nunn says, he asks him his opinion, and Nunn says, your team's not that good. I don't think you'll ever be a winner. So Dan Rooney says, well, why don't you help change it? So he asks him to help scout for the Steelers. But Nunn continued writing, but he's now scouting. And at the time, maybe it wasn't that unusual. I know, Chuck, that might raise your conflict of interest flags as a journalist.
It's funny. I thought about this, and 3 years ago, I would have raised my conflict of interest. What is the era we're living in now?
Conflict of interest, right? It's no different than Troy. It's not as bad, I would say, as Troy Aikman, calling games for ESPN Monday Night Football and serving as a paid consultant for the Miami Dolphins, where he
or Tom Brady.
Tom Brady's the ownership stake, and it's other sports too, like Shaquille O'Neal and Grant Hill. They have ownership stakes.
But this is not old. I mean, I remember my father complaining all the time that Frank Broyles was the color commentator for college football with Keith Jackson during the 80s. You know what else Frank Broyles was doing at the time? He was the athletic director for the University of Arkansas, like the active athletic director for the University of Arkansas. Is that fair?
So Sid Hartman in Minneapolis, long-time sports columnist in Minneapolis, like I'm talking like 7 decades long. He was like the first general manager for the Minneapolis Lakers and the sports columnist in town. So it's something that's old. It kind of went away, and now it's definitely back. But
right, we got Woj, right? He left sports writing to go run the St. Bonaventure basketball.
Left, though. He's not still writing.
Yeah.
He left
to
become the general manager at St. Bonaventure. So he didn't try to do both. But Bill Nunn here was doing both. But it was a great insight, and it leads the way, right? At a time when major colleges aren't looking at black players, and a lot of NFL teams aren't looking at black players or players from HBCUs.
Well, even on the major Steelers, teams, there were clearly quotas. Right.
So some of the guys he finds, John Stallworth, Mel Blount, Ernie Holmes, Donnie Shell, Frank Lewis, Joe Gilliam, right? They've got this advantage because they're taking these HBCU guys seriously.
In that era, even the major college programs that were integrated only were a little bit integrated, right? It was...
They did have a quota, right? There was
clearly quotas. Some of them may not admit it at Alabama or at Penn State, or but there certainly seemed to be at the beginning, or else, I mean, let's be frank, these HBCU programs wouldn't be as successful as they were in the late 60s and early 70s.
And it builds on each other because the Steelers have, because they're willing to draft players from HBCUs, it becomes a better place for HBCU graduates to play, right? You've got a locker room. If you're a black player from the South coming to Pittsburgh for the first time, well, you have someone who maybe just went through that same experience a couple years ago, so you can have bonding within that locker room, right? So it's a friendly environment, And what's interesting to me, Chuck, is that the Steelers are becoming more of a melting pot at a time when America's racial fault lines are widening. Right, it's February of '68. The Kerner Committee, we're a long way from like the March on Washington in '64 and kind of the peak, the crest of the civil rights movement. Right now, by the late '60s, so February '68 is when the Kerner Commission report comes out. That's the one that had the famous line, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal." And then in April of 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. All the riots and the unrest that follows that, but the Steelers are going in a different direction from the rest of the nation. And I think it's part of it because of their backgrounds, right? Chuck Noll, again, grows up in a part of Cleveland where he's playing football with black people. He's just not caught up in race. Rocky Bleier, the running back who served in Vietnam, he was wounded by a bullet and a grenade, and it's a black soldier. He's serving in the integrated military. It's a black soldier that carries him the final steps of the way to safety. Right. And Bleier never found out his name, but I would imagine you would have fond thoughts toward black people if one of them saved your life. right? So the Steelers are going in a different direction from the racial unrest at that time.
It's not only good for society, it's good for football, winning football games. I mean, that,
And one last thing on Bill Nunn, though, is
yeah,
that it's this window of time, so eventually he goes over to the Steelers full time.
right.
And it's partly because at that time, the black press is in decline, and the traditionally white newspapers are not really in the process, or they're not prioritizing hiring black writers, right?
Right.
So maybe if the newspapers of the time, the big papers, had been more advanced, maybe he would have left Pittsburgh to go for the New York Times or the Washington Post,
Or he could have been at
or the
Sports
LA
Illustrated
Times or something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
something
but
like
that really wasn't an option for him back time. So he is available because of the racism that exists in the media world.
Probably peak Bill Nunn story, right, in the legend of Bill Nunn and the Steelers is the John Stallworth, is of course the 74 draft itself, but the Stallworth, like it's the story, and it's in multiple places. I got it in the Dan Rooney book. I know you got it in the other books about how essentially Chuck Noll's obsessed with Stallworth. They enter the 74 season. I mean, we open it. The Immaculate Reception happens at the end of 72. They don't get there again in 73, but they keep making the playoffs. But they realize they have a great defense. They need to open up their offense. They need some receivers. They need some, and so Lynn Swann is obviously is they get early, and he
From
wants
USC.
Stallworth, right? And he wants.
I mean,
Stallworth.
and Noll wanted Swann, or he wanted Stallworth ahead of Swann.
He thought Stallworth, right? He was the number one guy in his head the whole time. And Bill Nunn is one of the scouts that goes to the, I guess you could call them pro days, right? Either at the Senior Bowl or you have these various pro days, and Stallworth has a pro day. And the film that everybody gets of Stallworth is Stallworth doing some of his runs in like this terrible weather. So his times are slower. And so Nunn, for whatever reason, thinks that this is an issue and decides to stay back. Everybody else is moving on. And he then gets Stallworth to do the times one more time just on his own. So he's got his own, and he realizes, no, Stallworth is what everybody thinks he is. But the rest of the league is going to have this basically faulty film of him. And so he, basically, Noll wants to draft him early, and Nunn is telling him, no. He'll be there in the fourth round. The second round comes around. He wants to take Stallworth. No. You can wait. The Steelers that year don't have a third round pick. You can wait till the fourth round. I promise you he'll be there. And luckily, probably for Bill Nunn's relationship with Chuck Noll, Stallworth was there in the fourth round.
One quick line about Swann. Lionel Taylor, the Steelers receivers coach at the time. So he saw Swann at the Senior Bowl, and his scouting report was, quote, "Only thing I know about Swann is this: some bitch gets open and catches the football." Classic old school scouting, right?
That's one way to find out, right? Well, hey, it's it is what it is.
So those are some behind the scenes stories on some of the key draft picks. And when we come back, we'll really dive into that draft run that the Steelers had in the 1970s that made them dynastic. That's coming up after this.
All right, let's get to what was essentially the draft machine. So just to recap here, 9 Hall of Famers for the Pittsburgh Steelers were drafted over 6 drafts from 69 to 74. The first one was Joe Greene, drafted in 69. Mel Blount and Terry Bradshaw in 70, Jack Ham in 71, Franco Harris in 72, and then, of course, that iconic 1974 class. It is just easily, and when you see how many of them ended up in the Hall of Fame, it really is the greatest draft run that there is. You can't, even when the NBA was just handing draft picks to the Lakers and Celtics willy-nilly in the early 80s.
They were trading for them.
Right. Or getting sold, right? Or they were like, it always felt like, how did the Lakers win a championship, get the number 1 pick again, right? Somehow the Celtics and the Lakers ended up with all those guys. But setting that aside, there really is nothing. It's not even close. I guess Duncan and Robinson with San Antonio might be, and that wasn't even back-to-back years.
So part of it is the Steelers going beyond the norm. So you might have heard the term Blesto draft service. I learned in the research for this.
I didn't know what that was.
Yeah, it
And
was
Bill
a
Nunn was a
consortium
part of
actually.
it.
So Blesto, it comes from a combination of Bears, Lions, Eagles, Steelers. The BLEST. That's where it comes from. So there was a consortium. So the Cowboys were really getting into computer data and computer assisted drafting. So they would crunch all the numbers, and they were kind of ahead of the game in that. And the Cowboys, who became the Steelers' rivals in the 1970s, right? So they were drafting on the basis this computer assisted drafting and computerizing their draft process. And again, the Steelers won by incorporating Bill Nunn and really gaining the edge on getting the players out of the HBCU schools. So different approaches. They both worked. You could argue the Steelers' way worked a little bit better, but it's not like the Cowboys, were falling far behind. But it is amazing how those two franchises really left the NFL in the dust.
There was one time where Chuck Noll's choice was overruled by ownership, and it was due to a certain star running back for the Penn State Nittany Lions. At the time, Noll wants Robert Newhouse, and he's a running back, and who ends up, by the way, a Dallas Cowboy. They would see later in a Super Bowl. But Art Rooney Jr., Dan's brother, wants Franco Harris. Franco Harris is the Penn State kind of hometown, if you will. There's the Italian, Franco's Army that ends up developing later.
Franco's Italian Army, right?
Yeah.
Started by a local pizza shop owner.
And not everybody was thrilled with Franco, and it wasn't clear. But first preseason game he shows up in, takes his first pitch, he gets 75 yards and scores a touchdown, and the rest ends up being history. But that was one of the few times where Noll got overruled.
Yeah, and it paid off pretty quickly. So he rushed for 1,000 yards as a rookie, and rushed for 1,000 yards over 6 straight seasons from 1974 to 79. And that's when 1,000 yards meant something. These were 14-game seasons, right? Now we got 17-game seasons. 1,000 isn't so much. But in the 14-game era, he was rushing for 1,000 yards regularly. Now, O.J. Simpson, of course, rushed for 2,000 yards in 14 games. But Franco was a consistent runner. Took some flack for, not always absorbing punishment. He wasn't Jim Brown. Right, like if the sidelines were there and he had the choice between stepping out of bounds or getting hit by some linebacker, he was going to step out of bounds.
By the way, that always kind of followed him a little bit. I remember when he was starting to break some all-time records, there was a lot of yeah buts with Franco in the mid '80s. There was a lot of yeah buts, and in hindsight, pretty unfair.
Well, also, I mean, we see, especially today, we see the short lifespan of NFL running backs and the ones who take all that punishment.
It's
I mean, how many running backs?
Look at his durability.
Yeah, and he did last for a long time. And how many running backs last 6 years, let alone put together 6 straight 1,000-yard rushing seasons?
Yeah.
Right. So he was a thoughtful person. He was thoughtful on the field. He was very thoughtful with his answers as well. So an interesting person. The son of a black father who served in the army in Italy in World War II and met Franco's mother in Pisa. She was someone who hid from the Nazis during the war, and I like that. Really Italian. She had brothers with names like Giuseppe and Mario and siblings named Daniela.
Yeah.
But it's important to know he himself identified as black, despite all the Franco's Italian Army. They ran it by him, right? Before they started this up. And, he okayed it. So he kind of had the best of both worlds. Pomerantz pointed out, like the black waiters in the stadium, they were rooting for Franco too. They saw him as one of them, and the Italian Army saw him as one of them. So again, we talk about the melting pot of the Steelers, really embodied by Franco Harris.
Franco, in some ways, the perfect symbol for the team. 72. I mean, we get there. The reason the Steelers arguably don't make a Super Bowl is they have everything going for them except quarterback. Right? Yes, they drafted Bradshaw. They'd had Hanratty. They had Joe Gilliam. And Joe Gilliam is the one with a live arm. And, back then quarterbacks called their own plays.
Yeah.
And Gilliam guess what Gilliam loved to do? Throw the ball deep. he wanted to push and push and push. And he had some success early. And, he gets in mostly because I think everybody's injured, and he gets in at first, and then he has some success. But it drives Noll crazy because he won't use the game plan that Noll wants. He won't run the ball enough.
It's tricky for him, but he plays well in the exhibition season, and Noll says it'd be hard not to start him, right? At a time when you're not seeing black quarterback, that's not normal. It's not, what we've become accustomed to. You can imagine this in the early 70s. The newspaper headline when they name him the starter is, "Guess who's coming to quarterback?" A not so subtle play off the
right.
"Guess who's coming to dinner,"
which of course back then was
the
an
Sports
iconic
Illustrated cover.
Yeah,
Pittsburgh's black quarterback. That was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. So, it's a big deal. It made the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather when he was named the starter. So, and Bradshaw's not happy about this. He wants to be traded over that. So, Art Sr., he liked Bradshaw. He'd go to dinner with them. They'd watch Monday Night Football together. He liked Bradshaw, as you mentioned. Joe Greene goes to Noll and says it should be Bradshaw. Gilliam, not only is he dealing with racist letters, death threats, but the physical toll is getting to him. So he gets pounded. Week 3, they lose to the Raiders, their rival, 17-0, and he's in severe pain. And that night he gets talked into going to a party, and he tries heroin for the first time. And later, famously with Brett Favre, for example, painkillers and opioids would, and those addiction issues, to deal with the pain and the physical toll of playing NFL football and quarterback in particular. So that wasn't Favre's downfall, right? But it became a major issue for him, and he was far from the only NFL player to become addicted to opioids and painkillers. And in this case, it was heroin, though, for Gilliam.
When you think about the 70s and the number of players that could have been, the number of could have beens, right? In a lot of leagues, it was baseball. The drugs of the 70s and 80s took away a lot of careers that might have been Hall of Fame, right? We don't know what Joe Gilliam, maybe he gets onto another team. Sure, maybe Pittsburgh plays Bradshaw, but maybe Gilliam gets on another team and, he becomes, the first iconic black NFL quarterback, before there's Doug Williams, before there's Warren Moon on that front.
And the Steelers were 4-1-1 with him. They were winning. His performances were uneven, but the fans are chanting, "We want Bradshaw."
Yeah.
We want Bradshaw.
It's still hard not to see race sort of circulating among the fans, right? Which is why the fact that the team doesn't fall apart and get sucked into that clearly is, you got to give both Noll and Greene credit for that.
And you give the Steelers for giving Gilliam the shot in the first place, knowing what the reaction was likely going to be, right? They were unafraid of race. I don't necessarily get the sense that they were forerunners and leaders on race, but they were unafraid of any racial issues.
It's funny. We both keep dancing around this, right? Because you can't sit here and say they weren't at the forefront of anything, arguably, but they were never going to be the last team.
Right.
Yeah.
They were unencumbered by race.
Well, Bill Nunn, look, Dan Rooney it's a bit self-serving to put it in your own autobiography, right? So I fully want to couch this quote that way, but Dan Rooney puts a Bill Nunn quote that Bill Nunn gave to somebody else about Dan Rooney, and he said, "He's the first man I ever met who I truly believed didn't see race." And it's hard not to believe that with Dan Rooney, his story, sort of how he grew up, and when you grow up around that sports world that his father occupied in the early days. Well, it wasn't race blind, but it was integrated. right? The boxing was integrated. So it was, they lived a more integrated life than most segregated communities did. I think the Rooneys did.
And like they literally walked it, right? So the Steelers draft White. He's from Dallas. He's wary of the racism in Pittsburgh. And he would walk around though, and he would see Rooney in all parts of town, right? Black, white, you'd see Art Rooney there, and he gained respect for him that way, right? And so literally they didn't just talk it, they walked it.
I love that Joe Greene admits, he goes, man, if you'd asked me what's the last team I wanted to be drafted by, he said it was the Pittsburgh Steelers.
And him and Art Rooney became really close.
Yeah.
And, Art Sr. would send him postcards, and Rooney was a big postcard guy. But when after he passed away, they just found so many postcards and exchanges that Rooney and Joe Greene had.
So here we are. They've built the structure. They've assembled the talent. They found their coach. And it takes us to the moment that arguably the dynasty is built on. Now, I will tell you this. If you'd have asked me 15 years ago, did the Immaculate Reception happen, after the Steelers win, did they win the Super Bowl? I would have said yes. I think
if you would ask me 5 weeks ago,
right?
I would have said yes.
that it's funny. The Immaculate Reception births the dynasty, but they don't make the Super Bowl that year. They actually lose the next week. And you know what? When you go through the story,
they lose to the undefeated Dolphin team.
Right. It is, and that's what I want to get to, because it's arguably 8 days of probably the most memorable 8 days in the history of Pittsburgh sports. Right. And I think that's why we probably got to go back and live in it. So, and I have to tell you, I just fell in love with Dan Rooney's version of this and how he did it. So it's December 23rd, 1972. And as you say, the number 1 seed is the undefeated Miami Dolphins. This is Steelers Raiders. And as we've now outlined to you, the Raiders are really the chief rival of the Steelers in the 70s. And you're starting to see this budding rivalry was actually off the field, right? Al Davis complaining about the Steelers getting everything that they want in the AFC and all of this stuff. So it's starting to turn into a rivalry, and this game will cement it. But here's the other significance about this game. This is the first Steelers home playoff game, J.A., in 25 years. 25 years, right? An entire generation of fans had never seen a playoff football game in Pittsburgh. And to say the place was electric, Dan Rooney's account, he goes, he felt like the concrete might give way. That's how much the stadium was shaking. And let's be honest, this was a rock fight. Like a lot of NFL games back in the 70s were, right?
Especially the Steeler games.
Yeah, this was a rock fight. No shootout. It was a defensive struggle. It was ugly. It was hard. The Steelers lead 6-0 late in this game, all on field goals. That's it. And the Raiders have this backup quarterback that comes in. He's not the starter. But Kenny Stabler comes in late in the game, and he leads the Raiders to an immediate touchdown, and it's 7-6. So now there's less than a minute. Steelers have the ball. And, of course, everyone in that stadium assumes they know what's coming next. This game is over. They're going to lose like they have before. Well, Rooney's in the stands. And it is interesting to see, because some people argue, and we're going to get into this, about what replay would have said here. So Rooney's in the stands. He's watching this. And he's already bracing for it because he's seen it before over and over again. This is what the Steelers do. They get close. You think they're going to get there, and then they lose. So now it's
this
fourth
is Dan
down.
Rooney in the stands, right?
Dan Rooney in the stands.
Yeah.
It's fourth down. It's fourth and 10.
Because Art Sr. had got up, left the press box, and is in the elevator, heading down to the locker room, getting ready to give a consolation speech to the players.
To the players. Yes, that's important. Old man Rooney never sees the play. So never sees it live. Obviously, he ends up seeing it later. So Dan Rooney's in the stands. It's fourth and 10, 22 seconds. So I'm sure people have seen the NFL films. Bradshaw takes the snap. He rolls right. He escapes pressure, and he throws it towards Frenchie Fuqua. And then there's a collision with Jack Tatum, I believe.
Yeah, Jack Tatum.
Is that there? It's Tatum
Would
and
become
Fuqua.
famous for ending the career and paralyzing Stingley.
So this was a violent collision. All right, we're talking Tatum and Fuqua, and it's immediate. And Rooney claims he can hear it. He doesn't fully see it, but he feels like he can hear the collision. And he assumes that's it, game over. And he doesn't realize that the ball pops in the air. And something impossible happens. Franco Harris ends up with the ball, and we all can visualize that moment where he gets it off of his shoestrings, right, off of the cleats there, right before it hits the ground. And he's just running down the sideline. He stiff arms a guy. He stays in bounds, and it's a touchdown. Well, the officials are trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So then there's confusion everywhere. Nobody celebrates right away because nobody's quite sure, is this going to be good or not? So right. Rooney.
Because the question is whether Fuqua touched the ball first or Tatum touched the ball first.
And there's a rule.
If an offensive player touches the ball first, another player can't catch it.
Which, by the way, I didn't fully know that rule. That rule ends up getting changed later. I didn't know that but that was, and Rooney says everybody seems to know the rule. And so they're like, well, who touched it first and all of this? So Rooney runs to the press box. He's in the press box. Reporters are yelling, trying to figure out what the hell's going on. They're all trying to reconstruct the play. This is 1972. So you know what Three Rivers Stadium does not have, J.A.? A Jumbotron, okay?
No.
There's no replay in the stands. No Jumbotron clarity, no certainty. So it comes down, did Jack Tatum touch the ball? It's a touchdown. If Frenchie Fuqua touches it first, the play is dead, game over. So nobody knows. Then this is amazing. The referee leaves the field, walks to a phone in the baseball dugout. Remember, Three Rivers, both football and baseball. So he's in the baseball dugout, and he calls the league office. Art McNally is on the phone. And McNally just tells the referee, you have to call what you saw.
Yeah, go with what your men called.
By the way, my favorite part of this is that when the phone first rings, it's Rooney that answers, and they're looking for and he's like, where's the ref? And he's yelling around to hand the phone off. And he says, you have to call what you saw.
What a mess.
So this is it's not quite instant replay, but it's sort of like they just conferred with the league office. And the league like, well, what's the rule? Did any of you see Frenchie touch it, or did you see Tatum touch it, right?
It wasn't replayed, but it was reviewed.
Right. So the officials huddle, and then, you wait for what every fan, I say this as somebody who was in the stadium when Doug Flutie completed his famous Hail Mary, and for me, the only thing I could see to confirm it was when the officials do this. Well, that's exactly what happens in Three Rivers. They put the arms up, it's a touchdown, and the stadium goes crazy. Reporters are throwing papers. Players are mobbing Franco. And it's just sort of surreal. Nobody's quite sure it's real. Bradshaw, he says he didn't see it. He's on the ground. Franco, he just followed the ball. My favorite part is that Frenchie Fuqua will never say what happened with the play. Takes it to the grave. Won't say for sure whether he touched it or Tatum touched it. But I'll be honest, do you think that he would remember, even if it was right? Like, I'm sure a play like that happens bang, bang, right?
I know it happened, but to you, but how could you know? I mean, you probably concussed on the play, you got no idea of knowing for sure. So my favorite thing is that over a bar called the Interlude over on Court Street in Pittsburgh, a man who, Catholic school educated, stands up on a chair and declares, from this day on, today will forever be known as the Feast of the Immaculate Reception. Yay!
So that's where the name comes from. It's
from a
great.
guy in a bar.
Of course it is.
And then
it's fitting
he calls
that
over.
Yeah.
He's like, hey, that's pretty good. He got a good response. All right.
Yeah.
He calls over to the TV station where the broadcaster, Myron Cope, who does he's the Steelers play-by-play announcer. We'll get into him in a moment. He's getting ready to do a sportscast. So he's not as the radio voice of the Steelers, but he's also a local sportscaster. So the guy calls over and says, "Hey, we were calling it the Immaculate Reception." So he goes on there, repeats the name, and it becomes a part of NFL lore. This is a good place to talk about Myron Cope while we brought him up. Born Myron Kopelman, a guy who sounds like a mix of Howard Cosell and Chris Mad Dog Russo.
Yeah.
With those two guys. His signature phrase was "yoy," which I think is perfect because it's kind of like a mix of
That
the Yiddish
Yinzer
"oi"
and all that.
and
Yeah.
Pittsburgh Y, right? Yeah,
We're
yins
Y,
and
yeah,
yous
yeah.
and all that stuff.
Yeez.
Particularly good play would be a double yoy. There was a rare triple yoy. He said it's just something that just came out, and then he can never escape it. Be rocking down the street and people yoy. The creator of the terrible towel. So he was asked to come up with something for a playoff game in the mid 70s, and he decides, hey, let's do this, the terrible towel, and the yellow towels that Steelers fans wave and are, became ubiquitous and became associated with them. That was Hersberg child. So you can't tell the story of the Steelers without talking about Myron Cope. I'm glad a broadcaster is such an essential part of this story.
How about we've said Bill Nunn, the sports writer, Myron Cope, the broadcaster. I mean, it just is proof that you can't,
I think this is making the Steelers my favorite dynasty.
Right? Yeah.
The role that sports writers and broadcasters played in their story elevates them to number one in my list.
We journalists matter still, damn it. Gosh darn it. To go back to sort of wrap up the Immaculate Reception, John Madden and Al Davis, for years complained. Al Davis, of course, thought it was rigged, thought it was sort of the league deciding there was no way they were going to let the Raiders win. There's nothing like actually knowing that a phone call took place between the refs and the league office to convince Al Davis that the league was conspiring against him, right? Al Davis, I think when he took his last breath, assumed the NFL was behind it.
Probably want to file one last lawsuit before he fired.
In fairness to Al Davis and Madden, right? But for the Steelers, the Raiders are the team of the 70s, right? The Raiders might be the next great, right? They get to the Super Bowl second. They're the second AFL representative in the Super Bowl. And it is. John Madden only had his one Super Bowl in part because he had to play the Pittsburgh Steelers.
But it is amazing that he parlayed that one into something much more lucrative.
Well, that and a Miller Lite ad
than Chuck Noll's four, right? So, one last thing on the Immaculate Reception game. Again, I was stunned to find out that it really didn't effectively. I mean, maybe spiritually, but I thought that was the play that literally launched the dynasty, that they won the game and that they were on their way to the Super Bowl.
I did too. You just assume, but it doesn't, right? It actually is 2 years later.
Yeah, it wasn't even the AFC Championship game. So I think it has to go high, if not at the top. I think number one, in terms of games whose importance is a little bit overstated, has to be the Miracle on Ice, because Team USA did not win the gold medal when they beat the Soviet Union.
So it's the same, in some ways, the same thing as the Immaculate Reception.
Yeah, right? Although at least they went on the next game to win the gold medal. Like they didn't lose the next game like the Steelers did in this. I would say the Ray Allen shot, Game 6 of the 2013 NBA Finals, Heat versus Spurs. Ray Allen hits the last second three. So not only did it not win the series, it didn't even win the game. It just sent the game to overtime where the Heat then won, but then they had to win Game 7. So we put a lot of importance. I consider a very historic shot in NBA history, and certainly in the path of LeBron James. But it didn't, in and of itself, decide anything. Another one is the Kobe Shaq alley-oop, when Kobe in Game 7 to complete the comeback. But it was really more of an exclamation mark. Like they were going to win the game regardless of not. They already had the lead. They were in position to win the game. That just kind of, drove the point home. But it's seen as the moment when the Lakers won and went on to the NBA Finals and completed the comeback. But it was really icing on the cake.
The fact that it wasn't the AFC Championship game may actually explain why the Steelers don't win the next game. Because, first of all, it's the most talked about play in the history of the NFL. And so that week, it's the most talked about play. There is remember, this is the first ever playoff game at Three Rivers. and the fans are just overjoyed. So the classic hangover effect. So what happens? The next game, the Steelers play the Miami Dolphins. But in a weird twist, because the NFL, by 1975, they change it. But before 1975, the NFL decided the home playoff stadiums in advance, meaning they would say, okay, this year whoever went, the AFC Central will be the host, that playoff team will be the host playoff team, like whatever. There was this order, and they just rotated by divisions. So here you have the undefeated Miami Dolphins. At this point, they're 16-0. Coming in on December 31st, 1972, to Three Rivers Stadium. So the Steelers go from the Immaculate Reception in December 23rd. Well, guess what happens to the Dolphins? You think, oh, no, the Dolphins have to go play a road game Christmas Eve in Pittsburgh. It is 71 degrees at kickoff. Who was watching over? If you were wondering if God thought they had a rooting interest in this game, for the Steelers Dolphins, they created Miami-like weather on December 31st in Three Rivers in Pittsburgh. So in some ways, the Steelers were like, if we want to believe in these higher powers, it's sort of like the higher powers said, all right, we're going to give you your win, but let me tell you what's going to happen in 8 days. And we're going to, make sure the weather is for Miami, and not to sort of add, misery to this. But so the Steelers go on to lose this game to the Dolphins. Hours later, Roberto Clemente dies in a plane crash. The iconic Pittsburgh Pirate. And I've been stewing on this a while, J.A. Think about the 8 days of Pittsburgh sports fandom. December 23rd is the Immaculate Reception. And 8 days later, the most iconic player in Pittsburgh Pirate franchise history dies tragically in a plane crash.
So we talked earlier, the back-to-back days when Chuck Noll and Mean Joe Greene arrived in Pittsburgh, but you didn't know at the time how significant those were, right? So yes, those are majorly consequential events, but at the time you have no way of knowing. At those moments you knew, right? You knew that was one of the most incredible plays in NFL history, and then you knew the tragedy. I'm sure you could feel the loss instantly, with the death of Roberto Clemente. So just the impact, the finality, the drama, the swings, the emotional range for a city to go through. And I have a sense for what Pittsburgh is like after losing. I covered the AFC Championship game that led to, must have been 2000 or 2001, because that led to Brady's first Super Bowl. So he actually gets hurt in that game, and Drew Bledsoe has to come back in and secure the AFC Championship victory for the Patriots. But I remember being in Pittsburgh all weekend, and the whole city was just so hyped up. Pittsburgh's going to the Super Bowl. They're all ready to get back to the Super Bowl. And then they lost, and you could just feel. I went out to Primani's to get one of the famous sandwiches after the game. Just the whole city felt like the streets were deserted. And, the Steelers, and we get into this later, just how essential they became to that town, and you could feel it. So for them to lose, and then to lose one of the iconic figures, man for whom the bridge is named after now in Pittsburgh, I have the slightest bit, not having been from Pittsburgh or spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh, but having spent just enough time just seeing how this city reacts to a big loss to have a sense for what that loss was like for them.
And look, it's easy to say this looking backwards, but in some ways, maybe the entire city needed a year to mourn Clemente, right? Because the 73 season is somewhat of a lost season, right? And so even, it's clear the Immaculate Reception puts the Steelers on the NFL map. And I think it's you can't separate it out from the start of the dynasty. But it does take them until that 74 season, which we've already been hinting at a little bit with the quarterback controversies of 74.
But before we get to it, though, I do want to get to the formation of the Steel Curtain.
Yes.
So it starts to be really, it really comes together by 71. And, you the first all black starting line, right? In defensive line in NFL history.
Hmm.
And it really becomes dominant, right? They, they hold OJ Simpson to 49 yards rushing, when I think is a year removed from the 2,000-yard rushing season, right? The identity really comes together from this. Um, they have so reading about the steel curtain, it also reminded me. There's a great line from Dwight White. So the steel curtain
Hmm.
is Dwight White, Ernie Holmes, L.C. Greenwood, Mean Joe Greene. White says it was not so much what we did, it was the way we did it. We kicked their asses very thoroughly. Not just thoroughly, very thoroughly, right? Another thing about it, this was the first line to use stunts where the players would
Yeah.
go around, the end would go around the defensive lineman. They'd kind of switch places, and you get mismatches on the interior of the offensive line, right? Uh, George Perlis, who was a defensive coordinator, later went on to be the head coach of Michigan State.
Right.
He called it Stunt 4-3. And that was the name of the play, and stunt became the name throughout the league for when, the end and the tackle would kind of invert and go around each other to rush the quarterback. So
Yeah. Where would
innovative,
Micah Parsons be without the stunts? Right?
dominant, and they would just shut people down. Just a defensive force. So this is all coming together. This is part of the thing that is emerging as the Steelers are becoming dominant in the 1970s.
In the first Super Bowl, they end up in New Orleans. And it's, in some ways, their first Super Bowl victory feels like it was a defensive victory, 16-6, right? This wasn't, you talk about your first memory of the Steelers. It's the high-flying Lynn Swann,
Yeah, that
right?
game was
The high-flying
35-31. Yeah.
35-31. The first Super Bowl is the Steel Curtain Super Bowl. I mean, I think that's pretty fair. It was just about pounding the football and pounding on defense.
They held the Minnesota Vikings to 17 rushing yards in 21 attempts. Not even a
Good
yard
grief.
per carry.
Good grief.
So my favorite little detail on that is that Art Rooney Sr. liked to watch the games in the press box. He didn't like to be in the owner's box. He's more of a man of the people, even the media people. So he sits next to that game, next to Jim Murray of the Los Angeles Times, who, within a few years would be the person that I grew up reading and wanting to emulate. And then a couple of decades after that, I got the opportunity to work alongside when I got to the LA Times in 1997. So that's something that might not mean a lot to most of the audience. You're going to have to indulge me on this, but I found it very cool that Art Rooney watched their first Super Bowl championship sitting in the press box next to Jim Murray.
And that's the thing about, it's funny. The picture of all owners today is of rich guys looking for trophies. And there's a lot of owners that are rich guys looking for trophies. But there are still a small handful of teams that are owned essentially by the original family or a part of the original family, right? The Steelers are one. The Giants, at least partially so, right? The Maras are still there. And then, of course, you have the Hallis family with the Bears, and then you have
The Chiefs.
the community with the Green Bay Packers, and then on the AFL side you have the Hunts and the Chiefs. And I'm thinking around here, I think that's it, right? Where the wealth is the team, right? Where the team itself, and especially with Art Rooney. I mean, this is something, like I said, I will fully confess, did not realize, I just assume, I wonder what he made his money in. And you realize, oh, he never really did. He was just sort of a sport. He was basically, and we all know it was sort of the sports guy promoter. I'm sure some businessmen of the Pittsburgh era probably were dismissive of, oh, he's that boxing promoter, or he's that wrestling promoter, or he's that guy over here. And of course, he was probably building a more durable business than anything U.S. Steel could come up with.
And as we talked about in an earlier segment, the business model of the NFL, the revenue sharing from the national TV money allows for that, right? In baseball, Frank McCourt goes into bankruptcy because he couldn't afford the payroll even for the Los Angeles Dodgers because he didn't have enough outside money. But the Rooneys with, nowhere near the type of outside money that some of these private equity or tech guys coming into sports now have are able to compete with everyone thanks to the revenue sharing, the very socialist model of the NFL. One last note on the steel curtains. So researching them, it reminded me of the banners that they used to have. So you mentioned Three River Stadium earlier, and as we talked about in the Dodgers, Three River Stadium was one of that era of the generic round cookie cutter stadium that came about in the 60s and the 70s that were multi-purpose. But one of the benefits of them was because you had this stretch where the outfield walls were for baseball, fans could come and hang banners over these walls, these homemade banners that were, they could just paint whatever on them and hang them over. And in Pittsburgh in particular, they had this really well done line of the steel curtain, and it hand painted very lifelike representations of the four members of the defensive line. And I just remembered it in my head, and I started Googling, seeing if I could find anything about it. So it turns out the guy that had it kept it after all this time. And then in 2011, he auctioned it off and he got $57,000. So good for him. And I'm thankful for them for kind of preserving my memories intact. There were pictures of it. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I remember. These hand painted banners that they used to bring to Three River Stadium of the steel curtain, among other things. That was kind of cool. It's something that's been lost in the modern NFL.
It is, because I think now they don't want to let banners in, and there's always
fire
worried about
hazards,
political messaging, and all sort. Right? Everybody's fearful of And there was something about Monday. It was, for me, the memory of those homemade signs are Monday Night Football.
Yeah,
right. Because
a lot of them would be about Monday Night Football or Coastal,
right? And they were all just trying to get on TV. You know, there was that in John 3:16.
Remember that it would have. They would use the letters. CBS worked better than MNF or ABC, right? But they would spell out something, and they would use the call letters of the
by the way,
of whatever network the game was on.
What I love about this little memory that we're sharing here is this is social media before social media, right? I always joke that if I told you in 1990 that the single most important thing on a phone that you would carry with you is the camera. Right? Like, who would have bet on that in 1990? And yet, when you see how much people cared about getting on television or finding ways to get it, it turned out, boy, Steve Jobs knew. He understood it better than anybody else. We're narcissists, and we want to be on TV. And so, now, of course, everybody's got a phone.
That was your chance to get your message on, right? You could think, stew over, what has spelled ABC? Another Bradshaw completion. Okay,
yes.
And the ABC cameras would be more than happy to show it. You're promoting their product, and
if you said something about Don Meredith or Howard Cosell, and had some fun with it, especially if Danny had been drinking, you never, the lights, turn out the lights, all that stuff. One more, we're starting to dig into the Super Bowls here. My favorite fun fact of the first Super Bowl, right? We're talking about Chuck Noll, and he's such a serious guy and all this stuff. Well, the game's in New Orleans, and it wasn't Minnesota's first Super Bowl. They haven't won one yet, and they still haven't won one yet. But they had been there, done that. This was all new for Pittsburgh, and Bourbon Street. So you think, oh boy, what are they going to do? Chuck Noll gives the team no curfew. New Orleans, Bourbon Street. So what do you think they did? They went out. And Joe Greene, L.C. Greenwood, Dwight White, Ernie Holmes, they eat shrimp. They drink a lot of Heineken. The restaurant ran out. That's okay. Dwight White gets so sick, he missed an entire week of practice, but he played in the Super Bowl anyway. So it wasn't a pretty game, but it was Steelers football. And they win the game. But the fact that they were, and we could talk about, the dark side of the 70s and what it took to get players on the field.
Players but the going fact out that Bourbon Street is something I missed. I was at the Super Bowl in New Orleans in 2025. That was my first New Orleans Super Bowl. And, you didn't hear any stories about any players
these
on a
days,
purpose
right?
screen.
Nobody would ever do that, right? No coach would ever do that.
Because of those camera cell phones, right?
Yeah, it is. But 120,000 people show up in the freezing cold the day after the Super Bowl for that parade. I mean, it is. Look, they had won championships with their baseball team, and in fact, Bill Mazeroski, 1960, probably as iconic of a World Series win as any victory that any franchise has had in a World Series for Mazeroski. But this one, when you let's just say I've been brainwashed by Dan Rooney on this one, and he's not wrong, right? Football in some ways really was the heart, Western Pennsylvania and Central Ohio, right? That was football. Football in some ways was really born in that part of the country. So to bring the championship to Pittsburgh and to have these fan base to be this excited about it, in some ways is football coming full circle, right? The Canton Bulldogs aren't an NFL franchise, but maybe this was as close as you could get to Canton winning a Super Bowl.
And then they go back to back. They win Super Bowl 10 against Dallas. Lynn Swann, the MVP, 4 catches, 164 yards. Bradshaw concussed when he's hit on the kind of the game-clinching touchdown pass, the 70-yard TD pass that Bradshaw threw, calling an audible. But he survives, and instead of going to Disneyland, Bradshaw goes around the country singing country songs. He gets
this is when Bradshaw starts to become his own version of a celebrity.
Yeah.
With the blonde hair.
The 2K. He gets a small part in the movie Hooper with Burt Reynolds. He gets in a bar fight with Burt Reynolds.
Well, he ends up doing a few Burt Reynolds movies after that because Hooper was the first one.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, I loved him in Cannonball Run. One of the dumber movies that there is, but look, Bradshaw, in some ways he's been playing the character of Terry Bradshaw for 50 years now, and he's pretty good at it at this point.
He certainly goes on to be, the most famous and enduring, the one of the Steelers who's still a presence in our lives all these years later.
But that the second Super Bowl is the birth of this Cowboys-Steelers rivalry. It's interesting with Cowboys rivals. There's a lot of teams that claim rivalries with the Cowboys, don't they? Where they feel like the Cowboys are their rival. And there is something about, it feels like if there's such thing as a Super Bowl rivalry, the only Super Bowl rivalry I think we've ever really had is Steelers-Cowboys. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it certainly felt like it back then. And again, that was the first Super Bowl that I watched. And then it just felt like whenever they would meet in the regular season, it felt like such a big deal because they probably played in the Super Bowl the year before, and there was a good chance that they were going to face each other again in the Super Bowl. So, yeah, there's nothing like Cowboys-Steelers because it takes place. It's not a divisional rivalry. There's something about those divisional rivalries, right? But a Super Bowl rivalry, Cowboys versus Steelers.
No, look, it's probably the only equivalent to it in other sports is probably you got Dodgers-Yankees with a World Series rivalry, and you've got Lakers-Celtics. Right, with the NBA Finals rivalry, which, same thing. It made those regular season matchups only 2 a year in the NBA. They always felt like previews, that you were going to get something. Let's go back to your first Super Bowl that you remember, because one could argue, is that if you have to pick one Super Bowl Steelers team, right, of the 4, and if you can throw in the other 2, if they could only have one that they have to say is their best Super Bowl team, is it the 78 Super Bowl team?
I think so, because it probably holds up the best in the modern era. So they were more pass oriented. So the rules had changed. They called it because of the Steelers, the Mel Blount rule. They outlawed bump and run coverage. So in 78, Swann and Stallworth, 213 combined receptions for 33 touchdowns.
Wow. Really, but not until Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne did you have a pair like that, right?
Probably not, right? So you're and these are the 2 teams vying to become the team of the decade, right? So
the winner of this Super Bowl becomes the first NFL team to win 3.
Yeah.
No matter what happens here. So it's a BFD for the NFL.
So this is going to be the last Super Bowl played in the 1970s, right? You still have the 1979 season to come, but that Super Bowl is going to be played in 1980. So this is a Super Bowl in 1979, right? And yeah, so the two, and remember, this is really, it's over the previous 3 or 4 years that the Super Bowls become somewhat of the spectacle that it is now, right? The Super Bowl still had to establish itself. So we're only, we're still low numbers, XII, right? That's 13. And the Cowboys had just been dubbed America's team, I think the year before, or maybe it was this year. It might have been right after this year. They're coming off one of the Super Bowl losses when they're doing the NFL Films is doing its year in review, and they come up with the idea to call the Cowboys America's team, right? So it's all happening at this point. And so who's going to get to claim supremacy for the decade that's at stake? And I think that's a big thing.
Well, and I think you're right. Like look, the Namath Super Bowl is what puts arguably the Super Bowl on the map.
Right.
This is the Super Bowl where you realize football is bigger than anything. Because if you think about it, in 78, you had a Dodgers-Yankees World Series in October of 78. And it's the second of a back-to-back. So you're almost you're at peak baseball with that World Series, with their 2 most iconic franchises and the 2 largest cities meeting. And then that winter, you've got essentially the 2 most iconic NFL franchises in that moment, right, with Steelers and Cowboys. And I can tell you, 80 million people didn't watch that Dodger-Yankees World Series. I'm sure they had a lot of people watching that World Series. Right. But 80 million people didn't watch that World Series. 80 million people watched that Super Bowl. And every year after that, the Super Bowl would break another all-time record.
And so it concludes, it gives you in 79, they win. And then the Pittsburgh Pirates win the World Series later that year.
The City of Champions, yeah.
Right, and it's the City of Champions. It's the We Are Family Steelers. And it's really the Pirates have really come into power. So they have back-to-back MVPs, right? Mm-hmm. So Willie Stargell and Dave Parker, 79 and 78 respectively. They win the most valuable players. So it all comes together for the city of Pittsburgh at a time when the city itself isn't doing so great.
It's going the other way.
Yeah.
Right. The steel industry is, this is 10 years now, or it's just things are not, look, not to make this about our politics of today, but sort of the beginning, if, you wonder how we got here, it was the beginning of the hollowing out of our manufacturing sector. In some ways, Pittsburgh was the poster child. Now, they've also now been the poster child of reanimating, renewing themselves. Now it's wins, the most livable city, right, and all of that stuff. But it is this weird, and in some ways it makes the success of the Pirates and the Steelers that much more important to the city of Pittsburgh, right? Because everything else is lost around them. And the one thing that keeps them together, the one thing that keeps the community together is that. And we probably ought to close this section reminding people of this, because I got I got a little dorky about this, but it is the only city with at least 3 or more where every single major sports team has the same color scheme, black and gold.
Which I love, right? Like you can wear a Steelers, if you're a Pittsburgher, you can wear like a Steelers shirt and a Pirates hat, and it's all matching. Right? It's
all like no other major league sports city with 3 or more teams, let alone 4, but 3 or more teams, right? In Washington, 3 of
hockey sweater, right?
3 of the 4 here in Washington are red, white, and blue, but not the 4th, not the Commanders, right? Wherever you go, none of the 4 have the same that. And what I love is it actually goes back to what the original crest, family crest was of Sir William Pitt, of Sir Pitt, and it's like his crest was black and gold, and that's how it's the city's. In the city charter, the official colors of the city are black and gold. So it's fantastic that the professional sports teams have all embraced that. And, I guess, it would be a lot of fun if all of the Minneapolis teams were purple, right? Maybe that's why the Lakers have a little purple in them, for all we know.
Well before Prince, yeah, more than ever. They all need to bring it back.
Yeah.
Timberwolves have Prince Knights where they have some alternate purple jerseys, but yeah, they should
Yeah.
make purple their
I mean, they could go with
predominant
right between
colors.
Prince, the
Same as the
Purple
Twins.
People
Yeah.
Eaters, right? I mean, Purple Rain. I mean, come on, Minneapolis, you're missing out on something here that Pittsburgh is showing us. So, look, the '70s are the peak of the dynasty, but the Steelers become a different franchise and are never the same post 1970s. And they don't return back to their pre-1970s ways. We'll get into that after the break. So, as we say, 79, it is peak Pirates and Steelers, and they go to the White House together.
March of
That's
1980.
not something that happened very often. Yeah.
Joint trip. But it's difficult. It kind of the weight of it, not only the physical toll, but the pressure. So it was interesting in the lead up to the 2025 Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes had the opportunity to win a three-peat, and Terry Bradshaw was there calling the game for Fox. And one of my students actually did a story talking to some of the greats like Bradshaw and Joe Montana about what was at stake for Mahomes and what it would mean if he did win three straight. And so Bradshaw was very candid. He talked about this quote, "I found it hard because I was tired emotionally and mentally." He said it was so hard to win a Super Bowl. And then you win one back to back and you're just like, oh man, I got to do it again. And he said the pressure never went away. He said in the parade, you go downtown, they're not hollering, good luck, hope you win it next year. It's you better win it next year. And that was a lot for them. He would go into depressions after the Super Bowl. It would take him weeks to kind of pull out of it because you put so much into it and then you get it and it's never quite what you expect it to be. Right. And that's one thing about the Steelers is that they won at the highest levels. And it's not a story of just pure mirth and happiness and joy. Right. There's a lot of pain that came with it. It's just football, the nature of the sport itself, but also the pressure of winning it and the fact that winning never feels as good as losing feels bad.
It's funny how it just doesn't, and it's, you learn this in life, right? You attain you're so driven to get a goal, you attain it, and then you sometimes are like, well, now what? Right? What's the next goal? And you hear this with these great athletes, and sometimes they got to find a new ambition or they got to find a new drive, or sometimes they don't want to give it up. That's why they don't retire probably when they should retire. They usually hang on because they are driven and they want to keep succeeding and until they find that another thing to try to succeed in. And eventually Terry Bradshaw gets a broadcasting career and a bit of a cultural zeitgeist career. I don't know what else you'd call him, right? He not quite an acting career, but sort of, he was ubiquitous, right? Somehow, right? He was kind of John Madden-y,
yeah,
in some ways, on that front. But, here's something that I've always wondered about Bradshaw. How many injuries did he not get properly fixed in the 70s, right? If you have today's health and safety protocols, does Bradshaw have a career that lasts more successfully through the mid to late 80s?
You have to think so. He said he had more than 6 concussions, at least. Those are just the ones that he was diagnosed with, right? And just a litany of other injuries too. And so he's talked about the pain, the arthritis, the depression that he's done, all these things that were the consequence of it. And Mike Webster becomes kind of he winds up being the example of the longtime center for the Steelers, and he bore the brunt of that, right? And when you think of, and we started to really become aware of the brain damage that was done, and in addition all the other physical injuries, and Mike Webster dies in his early 50s, and just the last years were not good for him. He was someone who he would had marital issues, and he would drive his car and just park it outside where his ex-wife and their kids lived, and they would feel afraid. They were uncertain as to what he would do next.
There's a whole book about all the dead Pittsburgh Steelers, and it's because so many of them died. It all felt too soon, right? And Webster's one of them, and Joe Gilliam's one of them. It's just that one book that we used in here that focused on that was in some ways it's I don't want to say it's the darker side of football, but it is certainly the price that had to be paid for success in football. But particularly, we're better about it now. The health and safety protocols are better today than they were. But I could argue that this is still not a league that prioritizes player safety. They just don't de-emphasize it the way they once did.
In the 1980s, it's kind of the expiration not only of their careers but of their way and their formula. And they had won with defense. For as great as Stallworth and Harris and Swan and Bradshaw were, the strength of that team, the core of it, really was the defense. But thanks to the rule changes come along in the late 1970s, and then the innovation of offensive geniuses like Bill Walsh and the San Francisco 49ers and the West Coast offense, it's a new game. And the Steelers aren't prepared to, and Chuck Noll certainly isn't a willing participant in this new era. And then the other thing is the advantage that they had in drafting these HBCU players was going away, because as college football was becoming more integrated, now the best Black Southern players now have the opportunity to play in the Southeastern Conference or in the old Big 8 conference at Oklahoma or the Southwestern
honestly,
Conference.
I've always said, the rise of the Miami Hurricanes in the 80s was mostly due. They were one of the first college programs to recruit in the inner cities.
Yeah.
And that was, back then those players were going to HBCUs. They were going to Florida A&M in Florida, or they were not going to Miami, Florida State.
Exactly. So the Florida schools, the big SEC schools, it's changing. So that edge, that market inefficiency that the Steelers had been able to exploit, now that's gone away. And as Bradshaw retires, a lot of great quarterbacks come in the league, and the Steelers don't get any of them. John Elway, Dan Marino.
Well, the 83. I was just going to say, Johnny Unitas is clearly the quarterback that got away first in this franchise. But
there's the one they never got.
The one they never got, and they didn't. Not everybody wanted him.
Pitt.
Yeah, the Dan Marino. Yeah, that the Marino story is one of those. It's a little head scratcher, but they don't get him.
And it cost Art Rooney Jr. his job. So he was responsible for scouting. October 14th, 1986, Dan Rooney brings Art in for a meeting, and he tells him, I want you out of the day-to-day business. To me, it's reminiscent of The Godfather of Michael Corleone, who tells Tom Hagen, you're out, Tom. And so, for a brother to basically fire his brother is very Machiavellian, but I think that was the key miss, right? Missing on Marino cost him his job.
Well, Tony Dungy, who of course was an important part of that early Steelers staff there. He says that Noll didn't want to draft Marino because he thought it would have killed Bradshaw, and he still thought Bradshaw had a couple more years. It was a bit of a loyalty play. He chalked it up to loyalty. But it's interesting with Noll and Bradshaw, right? Bradshaw didn't always know where he stood with Noll, but at the end, he was protecting him.
He wasn't fond of him for most of the time together, though.
Right, but at the end, he was protective of him, and he didn't want to do this. And there's a little anecdote here that Noll calls Don Shula after Miami takes Marino, and he tells him, "You probably got the best guy in the draft." Like Noll knew it. So it's not that they didn't know, but they didn't have the guts to start. It's funny what created their team of the 70s. They hung on too long. Right.
So you compare that, say, with the 49ers, right, who you have an all-timer in Joe Montana, but you also have Steve Young there, and eventually they force out Montana and go with Young, and they do win another Super Bowl. So you wonder, God, if they had Marino, I mean, Marino gets to a Super Bowl pretty quickly in Miami. Right. It doesn't have the infrastructure around them that the Steelers had. So you wonder if the Steelers could have extended.
Can you imagine
just
Marino to Stallworth? Marino kept throwing to guys that nobody had ever heard of. I mean, no offense to the, Mark Duper and Mark Clayton became famous simply because they were the Marx brothers, because Marino got him the ball. But imagine if Marino gets to start throwing to John Stallworth, and it was really more Stallworth at that point than Swan. But imagine if he gets Stallworth. It's a whole different, it is an interesting fork in the road. And look, Marino fell in the draft because Marino got hurt his senior year at Pitt. So, it was one of those where he was available when Pittsburgh was drafting.
And all those guys from that great draft run are aging. And so as great as they did in that stretch, from 1975 to 1986, only 5 Steelers drafted in that stretch made the Pro Bowl.
Do Bradshaw and Noll ever make peace?
They do.
Yeah.
They make up. Bradshaw comes back. They ask him back for some type of ceremony, and he was wavering on it. And he came back, and he wasn't sure what type of reception he was going to get. And the fans just showered him in love and ovation, and I think that was enough to kind of bring him back in the fold.
Look, it's not like Noll and Bradshaw having an uncomfortable relationship. Belichick Brady, that was an ugly divorce. And the only difference between Noll and Bradshaw is that neither one of them went on to go win something else.
I mean, they were both, pretty much done, right? And but we'll see how Mike Vrabel works out, but not the guy that follows him. I mean, the Steelers really lucked out in that the guy that followed Noll was maybe not his equal, but was certainly up to the job.
Any other set of owners probably cut ties with Noll sooner than the Steelers. Right? I mean, if there's ever been a criticism of that you could argue they hung on to all 3 of their legendary coaches a few years too long. If you were judging that by sort of the way almost every other team handles their coaching situations.
It's funny because Bill Belichick became known for, he'd rather cut a guy too soon than too late. Right? But I think there's something when you establish an organizational ethos of stability that wins out over the long term. And I think it also buys you investment from the fans, right? You come to trust that this organization will get it right over the long term. And maybe there's a little bit of short-term suffering, but over the long term, they'll get it well. And there's this organizational stability in place. And it's not just at the coach. For example, it's like Steelers centers became almost like Steelers coaches. So when Mike Webster, who was the last of that great 70s team to retire, he was the center for 14 years. Dermontti Dawson replaces him. He's the center for 10 years. So you have 2 players at a very grueling position. You only have 2 players basically for 24 years at the center position. So that's the type of foundation that the Steelers had that I think allowed them to rebound pretty quickly.
I mean, when you look back at on the decade of the 80s, I don't want to call it a lost decade for the Steelers because they had a lost start to their franchise, right? The 50s,
Decades, right?
It is still, but if you actually look at all of the decades since the first 4 Super Bowls, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, the teens, you could argue the 80s is the worst decade in the modern history of the Steelers.
I mean, the fact that Noll stuck around through all of it, right? It probably is too long. That he wasn't the right guy for that decade, right? What the NFL had become
Well, because they hadn't, right. He didn't transition to a passing offense, even though ironically he was part of that Chargers staff that was like he was considered an innovator of his day in the early 70s.
But that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, literally different rules. You wonder if going to the 16-game schedule, he was a pretty tough practice guy, if maybe his teams weren't quite equipped for that longer season, as intense and as hard as he liked to go. Like, he was a big fan of the Oklahoma drill, right? Like the dreaded Oklahoma drill, where like a offensive player and a defensive player line up and the rest of the players all stand in a circle around them and they just go at it, right? Big fan of the Oklahoma drill. Yeah, longer season and changing ways of players, the Oklahoma drill might not be the way to go.
So in 1991, they go 7-9 in Chuck Noll's last season. So it is sort of it's one of those you're like, man, it considering how other Steelers coaches got to leave, right? The fact that he ends up with a losing record, 7-9, he decides it's over. It's certainly, the more I've learned about the Rooneys, if Noll wanted to keep coaching, they'd have let him keep coaching, I think. Don't you?
I think so. I mean, the two guys who replaced him essentially got to leave at their choosing, and on their timing. So given what we've seen, yeah, it feels like the coach gets to make the call. That's the ethos of the Steelers organization.
A couple of fun little anecdotes about his closing press conference. First of all, Noll, as you were talking about that, where he's riding with Dr. Z and he's looking at a frozen pond and he's got all these thoughts about a frozen pond. So I don't think it's going to shock you that at his closing press conference, he quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Perfect.
Okay. And he says, "Your actions speak so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying." And he kind of, when Noll left, he left. Part of the reason I think why Chuck Noll is not given sometime his immediate due, right? Football historians, immediately you go there and you realize his record stands for itself, for Super Bowls, all of those things. But when he left, man. It was very Johnny Carson, right? I was out, right? He just disappeared. He and his wife lived on a boat for months. I mean, when he left, he left. He flew his plane. He made wine. He liked conducting music. But when he left football, you didn't see him at a studio show.
Well, it's funny because that's not the template for those who have followed him, because Bill Cowher we see all the time on CBS, to the point that, for a while we kept thinking Cowher would come back to coach because he was still pretty young when he left, because he started so early. And nope, he just stayed at CBS, and we'd see him all the time. He hasn't gone away, but we see him. And then we just learned literally the day as we record this, the news is broken that Mike Tomlin is going to join the NBC studio show. So we'll be seeing Mike Tomlin. He's not going away.
And yet
but Chuck Noll went away. Right.
And of course, Mike Tomlin, everybody believes, is going to be on the short list of anybody who needs a new head coach next season, right? Like Cowher, those first couple of years in the studio, the first name on the tip of everybody's tongue is going to be Mike Tomlin.
I could see him being done. Because you know what? He'll know he'll never have another organization where it's like Pittsburgh, where you're never just one loss away from being fired.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you want to work for Arthur Blank or Dan or the Rooney family, right? And no disrespect to Mr. Blank, but he clearly is, he wants to win, and he wants to win now, right? You look at some of these, you want to work for Jerry Jones or you want to work for the Rooneys, right? Although Jerry Jones, one of the underrated parts of him, is weirdly loyal to his head coaches. He's actually been more loyal to his head coaches than he gets credit for.
Also, the Cowboys, good drafters.
Yeah, they are good drafters.
Pretty good draft record in the draft.
So Bill Cowher, when he's hired, it's kind of out of nowhere at the time. And there were two finalists. It was Bill Cowher and Dave Wannstedt. And I'm sorry, if you put Dave Wannstedt and Bill Cowher in a lineup, people would get him confused. Is he the guy that looks like he's from Pittsburgh with the mustache, or is he the guy with the mustache who looks like he's from Pittsburgh, right? Like are we sure they hired Cowher, that he didn't mean to hire Wannstedt, right? He's like, I wanted the guy with the mustache.
Well, it's funny, and Wannstedt comes to Chicago just a couple years after Cowher's in in Pittsburgh, and coming off the Cowboys. When the Cowboys were at the peak, he's on Jimmy Johnson's staff there that's winning Super Bowls, and there are all these high expectations. And so there's an affiliation from Western Pennsylvania people here in Chicago because of Mike Ditka, Western PA guy who was pretty successful and was very beloved in Chicago. So Wanstead checked all these boxes, and it just didn't work for him. Although he still liked and accepted, and he's on TV here in Chicago, so they haven't run him out of town permanently, but it just didn't work out as well as it worked out for Cowher and the Steelers. And you wonder if it worked out better for Cowher. Again, pretty similar in a lot of ways, and had similar success up to that point as assistant coaches, but you didn't have the organization.
Well, he was part of the Marty Schottenheimer tree, which wasn't a bad tree then.
Yeah. At least for regular season success.
And when he right, yeah, fair. And when he got the Steelers job, he had interviewed for the Browns head coaching job, and lost out to a guy named Bill Belichick. He was a finalist for the Bengals job, but lost out to a guy named Dave Shula, son of. And then he gets the call from Pittsburgh, and at 34. He's hired. He's got this great quote from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He says, "If I'm dreaming, don't wake me up. It's a hell of an honor for a young guy to come home and coach the Pittsburgh Steelers." I mean, it really was local kid done good.
So Cowher, while maybe not as innovative and creative in his use and integration of black players as Chuck Noll was, I'm going to give him credit kind of we're at this interim stage for black quarterbacks. So, the Steelers were way ahead of the game with Gilliam to think that later in that decade, Warren Moon comes out of Washington. So he's done in 1977, doesn't get drafted in the NFL because there was still that existing stigma of black quarterbacks, and has to play in the Canadian Football League for 7 years. Finally comes to the NFL with Houston in 1984 and goes on to have a Hall of Fame career from that point. Can you imagine if he played the entirety of his career in the NFL? So that's the 70s. Now by the time Cowher comes along, we've had Doug Williams in the Super Bowl with Washington, right? We've had Randall Cunningham in Philadelphia. And so the Steelers version of that, they draft Cordell Stewart out of Colorado. Certainly had the arm strength. If you saw that 70-yard,
one of the great Hail Marys
to Michael Westbrook in Michigan. I covered that game, by the way. I was just about to go downstairs, because Michigan was going to win the game. I was about to get in the elevator, like Hart Rooney during the Immaculate Reception. But I paused and I look at the ball, and Stewart drops back to his own 30, and he throws it all the way down the field to the end zone where Michael Westbrook catches it. So he had the arm strength. And
it might be the longest Hail Mary. I don't know if that is factual, but it might be. I mean,
I think it officially was 63 yards from the line of scrimmage, but he threw it a good 70 yards in the air. So he's adamant that he wants to come to the league as a quarterback. You still were seeing a lot of black quarterbacks in college get.
Oh, no. Let's make him a halfback or a receiver.
Wide receiver or something.
Yeah.
So they kind of reached a hybrid agreement. And he starts 80 games at quarterback for Pittsburgh, the Stewart, but he also rushes about 500 times for over 2,500 yards and 35 touchdowns rushing. He also winds up with 41 receptions for 658 yards and 5 touchdowns. And they call him slash, as in quarterback / running back / wide receiver. And so I think a very innovative way to use him by Cowher. So again, adjusting.
And by the way, I believe they end up with Antoine Randall, who was a quarterback at what is now a college football power in Indiana University. But back then, nobody ever thought of Indiana as a big. And he was a running quarterback that basically made Indiana more competitive than they should have been. And he ends up more having a bigger career being a receiver and being sort of slash too, if I'm not mistaken.
So Cowher with these compromises and hybrid usage. So I give him credit for that. So there were some issues for Stewart. He didn't work out as the long-term solution. Some of that was beyond his control. The Steelers went through, for example, 3 offensive coordinators in 3 years at one stretch while he was there. They had 12 offensive coordinators since 1990. So we look at the stability at the head coaching that wasn't there at offensive coordinator. Now, some of it was guys getting jobs like Bruce Arians, for example, getting head coaching jobs. But and I would say especially even more so under Tomlin, they just had trouble with that position. More stability at defensive coordinator, especially when Dick LeBeau was there for over a decade in the 2000s. But I don't think you saw that attrition of the assistant coaching staff in the 70s as you started to get in the 90s.
Well, one other thing on Cowher is he wanted a relationship with Noll and never could really develop one. First of all, there's this interesting detail. When Cowher arrives at the Steelers facility for his first day, Noll left absolutely nothing in the office. No playbooks, no notes, no handbooks, no files, no guide to how the organization works. The office was completely cleared. And Cowher's first reaction, as he described in his book, was complete disorientation. Like, how do you follow 23 years of institutional knowledge that walked out the door in one man's briefcase? And now over time, Noll, he sort of saw it as Noll's unspoken lesson of build it yourself, don't inherit my way, find your own way. And it may explain, there's this great anecdote where Noll and Cowher on a private plane together, and Cowher thinking, finally, I'm going to pick Chuck Noll's brain, and Noll's giving him nothing. Just a bunch of one-word answers,
So I'll ask you, would you rather deal with a legendary coach who won't leave anything behind in the office, or would you rather have a legendary coach who won't leave the office? Because that's what happened to Doug Williams when he took over for the legendary Eddie Robinson at Grambling, who had been his coach when Doug played at Grambling.
Right.
And, it wasn't going very well down the stretch for Eddie Robinson, who'd been
You're
there
describing Georgetown basketball, by the way, in the later years. When Big John just never would leave. He left, but he didn't leave, and he was always kind of hanging around. And it didn't matter whether his son was coach, didn't matter whether it was the old assistant that was coach. He just didn't leave.
So when Doug got there,
yeah,
he literally couldn't use the office because Eddie Robinson was still in there. I went down to do a story on all this, and right before I got there, Eddie had just left and moved into this. It was like a house on campus, and his office was there. And I'll never forget, here's this all-time great coach, winningest coach in college football or among them. And he's sitting there, and he's just got all of his stuff in like a little temporary box on the side. It's got kind of like a little cardboard desk almost. He's sitting there. Yeah. And Eddie Robinson is there. And this woman, this freshman, pokes her head in. She has no idea where she is or who she's talking to. She says, "Do you know where the bookstore is?" And he says, "Bookstore? It's that way." And smiles at her, and she walks, not knowing who she just talked to, this Hall of Fame coach. And so a lot of times the ending is not there. There's really no good way for it. Doesn't Bill Belichick, didn't he deserve better than the way it went down at the end? So very few get their way. Honestly, Cowher and Tomlin had as graceful an exit as you could ask for.
Well, especially Cowher, right? Like, he got to sort of leave. He was getting, I mean, it's interesting about Cowher. He gets to a Super Bowl pretty quick, right? Gets there in 95. They lose to what was probably the best version of the Cowboys that we've ever seen, right? In that 95 Super Bowl. I mean, I don't know what your thought is on that first Cowher Super Bowl, but that felt like a Steelers team that was lucky to get there.
Yeah, was
right.
Neil O'Donnell quarterback. Like
yeah.
It was a far cry from Super Bowl 13. Put it that
way.
Right.
And it wasn't. And then later, the one Super Bowl that Cowher does get back in 10 years later in 2005, that team felt more worthy and felt a little bit more like the original Dynasty of the 70s rather than this one. But look, Cowher has a pretty, Cowher started developing a bit of a reputation for not being able to win the big one, right? He gets to the playoffs quite a bit, goes to that one Super Bowl, loses, gets to the AFC title game, but he can't seem to win the big one until they have their magical season of 2005, which is probably one of the more iconic seasons in Steel, that isn't part of those 70s teams.
Although I covered that Super Bowl, and yeah, it wasn't a great dominant performance. And I'll never forget, before the game, Ben Roethlisberger is going around, like his teammates are stretching on the field, and he's going around hyping everybody up. And I remember thinking, he seems to be trying a little too hard. He seems a little too into this. And he admitted later that he He was
He's still a
overamped.
kid.
Yeah.
Let's
And
not forget, like this is his second year in the NFL, I want to
yeah,
say.
he gets to the AFC Championship his first year.
Yeah.
And this isn't a second. I think it'd been a little bit longer. But he didn't know how to approach this in this game. But they won nevertheless. I will say that's when I really felt the impact of the Steeler fandom, because we're in Detroit at Ford Field, and it felt like all the Seahawks fans were like in one little corner in the upper level of the stadium, and like the rest was all Pittsburgh fans. It was really an impressive showing by them at a supposedly neutral site. They just completely took over.
Well, this is where, when you say Cowher truly left sort of on a high note, right? I mean, he gets his Super Bowl in 2005, and he resigns the following year. And, of course, as we noted, was rumored to be the next coach of about 4 or 5 different teams for about 2 or 3 years, until people finally realized Cowher's done. He lived that coach's life. And I think what we're learning about, especially the modern day NFL head coach, it's a 7-day-a-week job, 365 days a year. There's no off season.
And there's increasingly no way to turn off the noise, to just go fishing or golfing and just clear your head and get away from it. Like, it's all right there in your pocket, right? You can never escape it. You're reachable everywhere. I give Cowher a lot of credit, and it tells you something that he had opportunities to come back, and I'm good here on the TV set. And again, I feel like that will be the template for Tomlin. I'd be more surprised if Tomlin comes back than I would be if he does not come back.
I mean, is Dick Vermeil the only coach that actually accomplished something bigger after retirement like that? Because Vermeil hadn't gotten a Super Bowl. He got to one as the Eagles coach. He retires, he comes back out of retirement, and then wins one with the St. Louis Rams.
Yeah.
Feels like Vermeil. Like, I think about Jimmy Johnson after the Cowboys. He goes to the Dolphins. It's not quite the same. We're watching Bill Belichick with North Carolina. It's not quite the same, right? It's hard to have a better second act.
Don Shula's second act with the Dolphins after the Colts, right?
True, but the second act became so good, people forget about the first act with the Colts, right?
But you're right. We think of him with the Dolphins more than, there's streets and whatever else named after him.
The Don Shula Expressway, brother.
Yeah, not just the street. Sorry, the expressway.
That's right. No, if you're in Miami or LA, you want an expressway. You don't just want a street. Look, Tomlin's early massive success, right? And that is, right? You're in a Super Bowl that quickly. You win one quickly. You go back again. They lose to the Packers, but still, I mean, that's, he has that amazing early run. And I do think it allows him to survive a lot of 9 and 8 years towards the end of, because you could start to hear the
streak alive, but
you could start to hear the chatter over the last few years. And look, they've had a hard time transition. They had a hard time finding a replacement for Bradshaw. And arguably, you could make the case they didn't really find their successor until Roethlisberger, right? And then they had a hard time replacing Big Ben.
And to me, that's the kind of story behind the story when you look at Tomlin's lack of postseason success, right? Because he was successful in terms of winning more games than he lost, but they got stuck where they just weren't going anywhere once they get to the playoffs. But look at the quarterbacks that he had post Roethlisberger, and even some of the years he had Roethlisberger, when Roethlisberger would get hurt and he'd just kind of have to patch things together just to keep that winning streak intact, right? Years with winning record streak intact. So, turnover at offensive coordinator position, I've talked about that, and just the lack of finding that next great quarterback, which most NFL teams are perennially searching. Look at the Chicago Bears.
Right. Talk about a team.
Searching for
right. They're still looking for their first
Right.
They're still looking for a 4,000-yard quarterback. Remember, they haven't had one yet.
Exactly. So, I think he did a great job establishing the mentality and an identity of that team. It was interesting. His first year on the Monday morning quarterback, Peter King, spent some time with him, and Tomlin was very honest about how he basically had to portray a tougher persona than he really was. And he had to be a little bit meaner because he thought as a young coach coming in, he couldn't be soft and he couldn't be perceived as soft. So he just kind of adopted this gruffer persona than he really was. And I think it worked for him. I think it was very strategic, and I think it was a good strategy.
Well, look, we've hinted at a few of, I guess you could call them warts, if you will. Every franchise that's been along, they're not quite at their 100th birthday, but they're going to have some. I would probably say the highest profile sort of, and it's a bit of a weird story, and it gets into the Raiders-Steelers rivalry, and it's the Chuck Noll, George Atkinson trial of 1976 and 77. Let me give the quick rundown. In December of 75, George Atkinson for the Raiders, it's called the Second Ice Bowl at the time. They're playing in Three Rivers. It's like concrete on the ground. And Atkinson hits Swan so hard that Chuck Noll makes a comment, and he refers to Atkinson without saying him by name as sort of, there's a criminal element in the NFL, and he sort of makes this comment. Well, Atkinson takes it personally. He files a $3 million defamation suit against Chuck Noll. And in the summer of 77, this case goes to trial in federal court, get this, in Oakland.
Whoops.
Okay, so and Noll, there was some thought, just settle it, do this. Noll's like, screw that, I'm fighting. And it's a trial. He testifies. There's no doubt this is like, you're really, think about it. This is in the summer. You got a training camp. You got all sorts of stuff. Anyway, the jury rules in Noll's favor that he's not liable, but it does cause all sorts of internal tumult because at one point he's on the stand and under cross-examination, Noll acknowledges that some Steeler players have delivered similar hits to what Atkinson did to Swan. And one of the names in the line of questioning is Mel Blount. Well, Mel Blount's already ticked off about his contract. And then all of a sudden he hears his own coach referring to him as part of the, quote, criminal element. And he decides to sue Chuck Noll for $5 million. Now, he ends up dropping it. He eventually stays on the team. The dynasty's intact. They win 2 more Super Bowls. But, man, that is one of the strangest stories that, again, it was one of those, I didn't know about it going in. I knew how violent the NFL was in the 70s. I didn't realize that one of the hits actually led to an actual trial at one point.
So my favorite detail on this is that
I think it only underscores that rivalry between the Raiders and Steelers as well.
Absolutely. So Atkinson's attorney in this case was Willie Brown.
Yes,
the sharp-dressed
Willie Brown,
future mayor of San Francisco and the speaker of the California State Assembly, and just a legendary wheeler and dealer in California politics. But he was the mayor. Although he was the attorney here. Yeah. He lost the case. So the jury deliberated for 4 hours. They ruled in favor of Noll, but it cost him, or certainly set back his relationship with.
Let me tell you how good of a politician Willie Brown was. He's the Democratic Speaker of the California Assembly. Republicans win a majority. So you would think he's no longer Speaker of the California Assembly. Guess who ends up staying Speaker of the California Assembly? That's how good Willie Brown was as a politician, man. It didn't matter what party was in charge. He was going to lead it. I mean, but I digress.
You probably talk an eagle into giving it his wings.
Oh,
right?
I think Willie Brown is one of the 5 most impressive politicians of the 20th century.
Certainly
when
impressive.
You look at his
great hat collection as well.
But he was just that effective. So that's a war. We got the drug use of the 70s. It's hard to talk about the Steelers, Mike Webster. Steroids were an open secret, and the drug culture of just the NFL was an open secret back then. My goodness, we got the movie and book North Dallas 40, which was basically a confessional.
Yeah, and speaking of confessionals, offensive guard Steve Corson, who played for the Steelers, confessed in Sports Illustrated in 1985 that he'd used steroids. He said he walked out of a pharmacy while wearing his Super Bowl ring with a bag full of steroids. There was an offensive tackle on Dallas who said he started using steroids in the late 70s because he saw how muscular the Steelers offensive linemen were. And so this defensive tackle, said that, he felt like he had to use steroids to keep up with the Steelers because the Steelers, he said, were using them and, they were the team to beat.
And then, of course, there's Roethlisberger. And in some ways, I don't know if that's ever been fully repaired with the franchise, repaired with the fan base, repaired. I feel like to this day, Roethlisberger, who was credibly accused of sexual assault, it's never really healed on that one.
I feel the reason why is because it was never fully adjudicated, right? It's not like there were no criminal charges brought up. The NFL with a lower burden of proof and not beholden to, the court of law, but just inference and vibes and optics, etc. They suspended Roethlisberger for 6 games for an incident that took place in a bar in which a woman said accused him of sexual assault in a bathroom of a bar. Also, like, it was like a college bar, and Roethlisberger has been in the league for a few years at a time. Just the unsavory nature of where he was.
The most generous thing you could call it was immature.
Yeah,
that's
bad judgment, right? So, the NFL thought there was something there, but it would be easier if we could definitively say, and if there was something in the court of law rather than
right. His name's not cleared, nor is it fully
exonerated.
Right. In either direction. Right. We don't have finality there, and it kind of hangs over his head a little bit.
So, and also, like, he's been kind of critical of the franchise, or certainly Tomlin lately. So,
which tells me that his relationship with the Rooneys is probably not so good, because my guess is you don't publicly criticize if you're in a and look, he should be pretty loyal to the Rooneys because the Rooneys took a gamble and took him back. Not everybody thought they would.
So they were able to mend the franchise quarterback, the all-time franchise quarterback, and that relationship with Bradshaw. But as we stand now, things aren't necessarily great and comfortable and easy with the most recent quarterback to win a Super Bowl for them.
You think Roethlisberger eventually gets in the Hall of Fame, or do you think this makes it harder?
He was a really great quarterback, and the problem is
got 2 rings,
Brady,
went to 3. He's got 2,
but
only
there's
Jim
Brady,
Plunkett's the only other guy I think that's got 2.
He has a last-minute touchdown drive in the Super Bowl, but the problem is that era, it was Brady, Manning. There were some great ones. Like, I would put.
Well, he was always the other
McNabb in, even though he didn't win Super Bowls. But Donovan McNabb was a really great quarterback that hasn't gotten his due. So, like, there's this whole group that was below the Brady, Manning, Favre, etc. That
Phillip Rivers is going to be
group.
Right. We're going to have this conversation about Phil Rivers as well, right, on that front. But Roethlisberger and Eli Manning have 2 rings means something, I think.
Well, so far it hasn't been enough for Eli Manning.
Yeah.
We'll see if it
well,
is.
like I said, Jim Plunkett has 2, and that hasn't been enough to get him in because he's got that uneven regular season. All right. It's the best part. The walk-off here. It's our Mount Rushmore. This is a tough one because I've got more than 4 candidates.
Only 4.
I know.
I'm
going to guess
places on that mountain. There's a ton, right? You could just do one just from that 74 drafts. You'd be pretty good shape.
I think you have to put a Rooney on there, but which one? I'm going to put Dan, not Art, on mine. Because that's the thing. You can have a debate about which Rooney you put on, but I'm only going to put one Rooney on. So I'm putting Dan Rooney on. There's my first one.
All right, one Rooney. Who else?
It's 4 Super Bowls. You have to put Chuck Noll. Like, to me, that's a no-brainer. So that's
what about
2.
A quarterback who wins 4 Super Bowls?
and he's arguably one of the most famous, not
enduring
people,
faces of the.
I was just gonna say, only Peyton Manning does more commercials, right? Than TB. So all of a sudden there's Bradshaw. That's 3. I mean, this is, I think I know where I'm going to go with my 4th. By the way, are all 3 of those on yours, or at least all 3 of those names?
2.
Okay. My 4th is going to be Joe Greene because he was first, right? He was the first. He was the anchor. He was the guy. He kept the team together when it could have been split with the quarterback controversy. He's iconic. The ad, there's the off. So my 4, and the only thing I'm concerned about is that it's all from one era, but it's Dan Rooney, Chuck Noll, Terry Bradshaw, Joe Greene.
Yeah, it's one era, but it's a hell of an era,
Yeah.
and it's the era that defines the Steelers. Like, to this day, it all goes back to that era, right? So I don't think you can go wrong. To me, it almost has to be. I think every Steeler on the Mount Rushmore has to be connected to that era in some way. So we agree on 3 of the 4. I have Chuck Noll, right. I've got Bradshaw, I've got me, Joe Greene. The defense has to be represented in there somehow.
That's right.
Right. And if there were fewer Rooneys involved, I could put one Rooney. So so like with the Lakers, Jerry Buss, kind of a singular, the greatest owner. I think he's easy to put on that franchise's Mount Rushmore. But because some of it's Art and some of it's Dan, and you kind of split the Rooney vote a little bit there. So that allowed, in my mind, for Lynn Swann to sneak in. And just like there were some questions about his Hall of Fame legitimacy, the numbers on Lynn Swann aren't that great, but you kind of had to see it, right? The grace of it, so this tough physical team, but he brings a different element, this graceful element, acrobatic element, the highlight plays, and he was inspirational. And so this is 9-year-old me, 8-year-old me talking here. My inner child is coming out when I nominate Lynn Swann and have him as my 4th member of the Mount Rushmore. But it's my Mount Rushmore, and
that's right.
He means the most of any of the Steelers to me, and so he stays on.
Well, I know the biggest pushback we may get is from Franco's Army.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about the iconic moment of the franchise is the Immaculate Reception, how could you not have him on there?
Right. Or how about a name that we have not mentioned enough in this, and I will confess to it. It's the bus, right? It's Jerome Bettis, right? He's when you had the conversation of greatest running back of all time in the franchise, it's a much closer call between Franco and Bettis than you fully realize.
Jack Ham or Jack Lambert, who kind of personified the Steelers. So there's that 1970 Sports Illustrated cover, the Man of Steel with Lambert in his helmet with the missing teeth, just looking like a tough guy.
Yeah, he sort of looks like, he looks like right out of the movie The Longest Yard. Right?
Yeah. And he just looks like a Pittsburgh Steeler, or a steel worker. And so it's tough to leave him out, but okay, he had his moment there. Again,
hey, Rocky Blyer got a movie, right? Vietnam veteran. Although there's a piece of him that is so there's iconic, and just the fact that it's a Vietnam veteran and he comes in but the more we talk about this, the more you realize, man, I had a harder time with this Mount Rushmore actually than I did with the Dodgers, and it's sort of that, because there's something about these Steelers that they're so connected. Yeah. One thing about the Steelers is you don't have somebody just for a year or two that shows up and it becomes iconic, right? When you become a Steeler and you're great, it feels like you're there for life.
And you wished it was more of a connection afterward with all of them together, right? So, the second half of that Pomerantz book is just about how they did stay connected and the ways that they interacted after the glory days were over. But it didn't necessarily always have them coming back to Pittsburgh, and the tragedy with Franco Harris. So that's one thing about this franchise. For all the great players, they're really stingy with retiring the numbers. I think they've only retired 3 numbers, and one of the great tragedies was the week they were about to retire Franco Harris's number. Finally, he passes away that week,
Now, he knows it's going to happen. So he
Yeah.
did die knowing his number was being retired.
But he
which
didn't
in and
get
of
his
itself is a
moment.
big deal.
He didn't get
Yeah.
to go on the field
Didn't
and
get
get
his
all the adulation one last time and
Yeah.
see the number, raised up there or whatever they were going to do it unveiled. So just a great tragedy that it felt like it was so long overdue. And then when it finally happened,
Yeah.
he dies just days before the day, the moment was at hand. So, for a surprising amount of tragedy mixed in with this Steelers story of so much success.
It is, but there is, the thing that I really have developed a fondness for, and I always kind of had it, but now I get it, is why the team is so beloved and why it's so, and its connection with the city. And, I've always been, as a kid, I used to imitate Willie Stargell's batting stance. I thought it was the coolest thing, the bat spin. I mean, I tried to learn to become a switch hitter simply so I could.
I used to have the pirate
left-handed.
hats with the Stargell stars on them. You could buy those stars that
yes.
give out to the star of the game.
Willie Stargell, man, I just thought he was the coolest cat going. And there's something about the connection with the community, with the Steelers, that it is as tight as the Packers, and that, which I've really, know a lot about. And that's the thing I just take away here is just what an incredible fan base. And ultimately, I mean, to really suck up you could make a case that there's a spot on a Mount Rushmore for the Terrible Towel.
The Terrible Towel or Myron Cope?
Yeah, or Myron Cope too. Right.
Yoy, double yoy.
Yeah. All right, my friend. You ready to go to San Francisco and Philadelphia for our next one?
And Oakland. Don't leave out Oakland.
That's right. One
The
franchise
entirety of
that
the
will
Golden
touch
State.
Philadelphia, Oakland, and San Francisco. And we're gonna go indoors. We've been outdoors for our first two franchises, Dodgers, Steelers. We're gonna go indoors for our third one.
We're going to make a big splash with the Warriors.
Yeah, we'll have one more Steelers episode where we'll sort of respond to your questions. We'll do some corrections because we know we might have made a mistake or two. We want to be able to correct the record there, and we'll have somebody to help tell some stories of the iconic Pittsburgh Steelers.
So send your questions and comments. Follow us on social media at Dynastic Pod. At Dynastic Pod on all your favorite social media channels. We'll get to those the next time out. We want to thank you so much for sticking with us and helping us to grow this podcast. And we'll see you next time.
Like and subscribe. Thank you.